There is something quietly extraordinary about a place where the world gathers to imagine itself anew, where nations arrive with their finest achievements, their boldest dreams, and their visions of what tomorrow might hold. These are spaces that exist only briefly, temporary cities built for wonder, vast grounds where pavilions rise like monuments to human ingenuity, and where millions of footsteps echo through gardens and exhibition halls, carrying with them the hope that we might glimpse the future before it arrives. I find myself walking through memory tonight, through the grand avenues of Werbia of world fairs, those remarkable gatherings that have appeared across continents and centuries, each one a kaleidoscope of architecture and aspiration, each one a celebration of human creativity that blooms for a season and then vanishes, leaving behind only photographs and stories and the occasional tower that refuses to be forgotten. The air in these places always carried a particular quality, a mingling of anticipation and curiosity, the scent of new construction and distant cuisines, the sound of 1,000 languages braiding together into a kind of music, and always, always, the sensation that something unprecedented was unfolding just beyond the next pavilion, around the next corner, waiting to be discovered. Picture, if you will, a sprawling landscape transformed, what was once empty land or park or waterfront, becoming a fantastical realm of white plaster and steel, of electric lights strung like constellations, of fountains that catch the afternoon sun and throw rainbows across the pathways, where buildings rise in styles that blend the familiar with the utterly strange, where a medieval castle might stand beside a modernist tower, where temples and palaces and factories all coexist in harmonious impossibility. These gatherings have borne many names across the years: international expositions, universal exhibitions, world's fairs, expos, but beneath the varying titles lies a singular purpose: to gather the achievements of nations and display them for all to witness, to create a temporary museum of the present moment, a living catalogue of where humanity stands at a particular point in time, and what moments they captured, these crystallized instants of collective ambition. Some arrived in eras of profound transformation, when steam was giving way to electricity, when the telegraph was shrinking distances, when the very pace of life seemed to be accelerating beyond recognition. Others emerged in times of recovery, when nations sought to demonstrate resilience, to prove that progress could continue even after devastation. And still others appeared during periods of intense competition, when countries vied to outshine one another with displays of technological prowess and cultural richness. But always, beneath the nationalistic pride and the corporate marketing and the political maneuvering, there existed something more intimate, more human, a child's first glimpse of a motion picture, a farmer from the countryside encountering electric light for the first time, an artist discovering techniques from a culture half a world away, a scientist examining innovations that would reshape entire industries. Tonight we walk through these vanished cities, these temporary wonderlands that once stood so solid and real, where visitors could spend an entire day and barely scratch the surface, where families saved for months to attend, where memories were forged that would last lifetimes. We trace the pathways between exhibitions, pause before the grand architectural statements, and consider the peculiar magic of a gathering designed to showcase everything, absolutely everything, that human beings had learned to create. The story of these fairs is not simply a story of buildings and inventions, though there are plenty of both. It is a story of aspiration, of the desire to see what others have accomplished and to be seen in turn. It is a story of cultural exchange happening at a scale both massive and oddly intimate. And it is a story that unfolds across more than a century and a half, from the first great gathering in a crystal palace to the sprawling digital spectacles of our present age. So let us begin at the beginning, when this tradition first took shape, when the very idea of bringing the entire world together under one roof seemed both audacious and somehow perfectly reasonable. When Victorian ingenuity and optimism combined to create something the world had never quite seen before. The year is 1851, and London is preparing to astonish itself. In Hyde Park, where fashionable Londoners have long strolled beneath ancient elms, something unprecedented is taking shape, a building unlike any the world has seen, constructed almost entirely of glass and iron, rising from the ground in sections that fit together with mechanical precision, gleaming in the pale English sunlight like an enormous jewel box, or perhaps a cathedral made of light itself. They are calling it the Crystal Palace, though the name feels almost inadequate for what it represents. More than 600,000 square feet of exhibition space, nearly 1 million square feet of glass, all supported by an intricate lattice of iron framework, and all of it assembled in less than a year, using prefabricated parts that arrived on wagons and were bolted into place like pieces of an immense puzzle. The architect, Joseph Paxton, had built conservatories before, greenhouses for the Duke of Devonshire's exotic plants, but nothing on this scale, nothing that would house not just rare orchids, but the industrial and artistic achievements of nations from across the globe. His design was radical in its simplicity, modular sections that could be repeated endlessly, a structure that could be erected quickly and, in theory, dismantled just as easily when the exhibition concluded. And inside this glass cathedral, beneath the arched roof that rose high enough to enclose the park's mature elm trees, the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations began to take form. Britain, as the host nation and the world's foremost industrial power, claimed the western half of the building, filling it with steam engines and hydraulic presses, with textile machinery that could weave patterns of astonishing complexity, with locomotives and marine engines, with tools and instruments, with examples of every innovation that had made Britain the workshop of the world. The displays spoke of coal and steel, of factories and foundries, of an empire that spanned continents and commanded the seas, but the eastern half belonged to the world, or at least to those nations that chose to participate. And here the exhibition became something more than a showcase of British might. It became a conversation between cultures, a marketplace of ideas rendered in physical form. From France came exquisite porcelain and fine furniture, tapestries and bronzes, demonstrations of craftsmanship that reminded visitors that industry had not entirely supplanted art. From the German states arrived optical instruments and scientific apparatus, proof that precision and intellect could be as valuable as raw manufacturing power. The American contribution included Colt revolvers and McCormick's reaping machine, practical innovations that spoke to a young nation's pragmatic ingenuity, And then there were the more exotic displays, the ones that drew crowds throughout the long months of the exhibition. India sent elaborate textiles and the enormous Koh-i-Noor diamond displayed in a gilded cage at the center of the building, attracting visitors who queued for hours simply to glimpse its fabled fire. Turkey contributed ornate fountains. China sent carved ivory and silk screens, and from across the empire came raw materials and finished goods that testified to Britain's global reach. The opening ceremony took place on the 1st of May, 1851, and Queen Victoria herself attended, along with Prince Albert, whose vision and determination had brought the entire project into being. 25,000 season ticket holders filled the central transept, while outside, thousands more gathered to catch a glimpse of the spectacle. The Queen recorded in her journal that the occasion was one of the greatest and most moving days of her life, that the sight of all those nations gathered peacefully, all that industry and art assembled under one roof, filled her with emotions too deep for words. Over the next 5 months, more than 6 million visits were recorded, though the actual number of individual visitors was certainly lower, as many returned again and again, unable to exhaust the wonders in a single day. Special train excursions brought working-class families from the industrial cities of the Midlands and the North, offering them their first glimpse of London, their first encounter with the sheer scale of human achievement laid out in orderly rows beneath that glittering glass roof. The exhibition was many things at once. It was entertainment, a spectacle that dazzled and delighted, where one could spend hours simply wandering, discovering marvels both grand and minute. It was education, a living encyclopedia where visitors could see and sometimes touch the products of distant lands, could watch machines in operation, could learn how things were made. And it was also, inevitably, a statement of power and hierarchy, a demonstration that Britain stood at the center of the world, that progress and civilization radiated outward from this small island, and that the future would be shaped by steam and steel and the restless ingenuity of industrial enterprise. When the exhibition closed in October, the question arose of what to do with the Crystal Palace itself. Some argued for its preservation in Hyde Park, but others insisted that the park must be returned to its original purpose. Eventually, the entire structure was dismantled, moved to Sydenham in South London, and reconstructed on an even grander scale, where it stood for more than 80 years, hosting concerts and exhibitions and displays until fire consumed it on a November night in 1936, leaving only the memory of its glittering presence. But the idea, the concept of gathering the world's achievements in one place, that proved less ephemeral than glass and iron. Paris watched London's success with interest, and perhaps with a touch of competitive spirit. The French had a long tradition of industrial exhibitions, national affairs that showcased domestic achievements, but the Crystal Palace had demonstrated something larger, something that captured imaginations and drew visitors from across continents. And so, in 1855, Paris hosted its own Exposition Universelle, smaller than London's effort, but distinctly French in character, emphasizing art and culture alongside industrial prowess, establishing a pattern that would define French exhibitions for decades to come. The Place de l'Industrie rose along the Champs-Élysées, a more traditional structure than Paxton's glass cathedral, built of stone and iron in a style that honored classical architecture while incorporating modern materials. Inside, the French displayed their renowned luxury goods, their wines and cognacs, their fashion and furniture, demonstrating that industrialization need not mean the abandonment of beauty and refinement, but it was the Paris exhibition of 1867 that truly established the French approach to world's fairs. The Exposition Universelle of that year occupied the Champ de Mars, a vast parade ground near the recently completed École Militaire, and introduced innovations that would influence every subsequent fair. The main building was arranged in concentric rings, with machinery and raw materials at the center, then manufacturing, then furniture and fashion, and finally, at the outermost ring, fine arts. Visitors could walk in circles, moving outward through the stages of production and refinement, or they could walk radially, comparing how different nations approached the same categories. Napoleon III and Empress Eugénie presided over an exhibition that drew more than 10 million visitors. The fairgrounds included separate national pavilions for the first time, allowing countries to create architectural statements that reflected their own cultural identities. The Egyptian pavilion, the Russian dacha, the Tunisian palace, these structures added visual variety and turned the exhibition grounds into a kind of architectural world tour, a miniature global village where one could experience multiple cultures in an afternoon's walk. And there was food, outdoor cafes and restaurants serving cuisines from across the participating nations, turning the act of eating into part of the cultural education. This innovation, so obvious in retrospect, helped transform world's fairs from purely industrial and educational events into something more social, more recreational, places where families could spend entire days, where the experience became about more than simply viewing displays. The American presence at the 1867 Paris exhibition was modest. The nation was still recovering from its civil war, still stitching itself back together, still finding its footing on the world stage. But American inventors and manufacturers who did attend took careful notes, observed the scale and spectacle, and began to imagine what might be possible if the United States were to host such an event. That opportunity arrived sooner than expected. In 1876, as the nation prepared to celebrate the centennial of its independence, Philadelphia would welcome the world to an exhibition that announced America's emergence as an industrial power, that showcased a young nation's confidence and ambition, and that introduced millions of Americans to innovations that would transform their lives in the coming decades. But we are moving too quickly, jumping ahead before fully appreciating the pattern that was emerging in these early exhibitions. Each fair built upon the lessons of its predecessors, borrowed successful innovations, attempted to surpass what had come before. The exhibition buildings grew larger, the grounds more elaborate, the number of participating nations increased, and the public appetite for these spectacles seemed inexhaustible. In an era before mass media, before films and television and internet, World's Fairs offered a rare opportunity to see the world, to encounter foreign cultures and distant technologies without the expense and difficulty of actual travel. They arrived in a particular moment in history, these early exhibitions, a period when faith in progress felt almost boundless, when each year seemed to bring new inventions and improvements, when the application of science and industry promised to solve age-old problems of poverty and disease and ignorance. The exhibitions embodied this optimism, displayed it in tangible form, offered proof that humanity was advancing, that the future would be brighter than the past. And yet, even in these early celebrations of progress, there were complexities and contradictions. The same exhibitions that praised international cooperation often reinforced colonial hierarchies, displaying peoples from colonized lands as curiosities, as examples of cultures that had not yet achieved the industrial sophistication of European powers. The same events that celebrated human achievement often ignored the labor conditions and environmental costs that made such achievement possible. But on the fairgrounds themselves, beneath the exhibition halls and among the fountains and gardens, visitors experienced something simpler and more immediate. They witnessed wonders. They encountered the unfamiliar. They carried home memories of a magical place that existed briefly and then vanished, leaving behind only photographs and souvenirs and stories told to children and grandchildren. The Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition opened on a May morning in 1876, and with it, America announced its arrival on the world stage. Fairmount Park stretched along the Schuylkill River, transformed into a landscape of exhibition halls and gardens, of national pavilions and state buildings, all arranged with a careful eye toward both spectacle and practicality. The main building alone covered more than 20 acres under a single roof, making it the largest building in the world at that moment, a statement rendered in glass and iron that spoke of ambition and capability. President Ulysses Grant attended the opening ceremony, along with Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil, the first reigning monarch to visit the United States. Together they activated the enormous coreless steam engine in Machinery Hall, a monster of gleaming steel that stood 40 feet high and generated 1,400 horsepower, its massive flywheel turning with a steady rhythm that powered the machinery throughout the entire hall. Visitors would return again and again to watch it work, to stand in awe of its size and smooth precision, to feel the floor vibrate slightly with each revolution. But the coreless engine, for all its magnificence, was only the beginning. In the main building, nations displayed their finest products. Britain sent textiles and ceramics. France contributed wine and champagne alongside exquisite furniture and tapestries. Germany showcased precision instruments and scientific apparatus. Japan, recently emerged from centuries of isolation, presented an exhibition that captivated American audiences. Silk kimonos and lacquered screens, porcelain and prints, an aesthetic entirely different from European traditions, introducing many Americans to what would become a lasting fascination with Japanese art and design. The Women's Pavilion stood as a revolutionary addition, the first building at any World's Fair devoted entirely to women's achievements. Inside, visitors found inventions and artwork, scientific instruments and literary works, all created by women, challenging assumptions about gender and capability. The building itself had been designed by a woman architect, and much of its construction had been overseen by women, making a quiet but insistent argument about competence and equality. And then there was Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, demonstrated in a modest display that most visitors initially overlooked. A curiosity, they thought, a toy perhaps, but certainly not something that would transform human communication. Dom Pedro himself picked up the receiver during a demonstration, listened to Bell reciting Shakespeare from the other end of the wire, and reportedly exclaimed in amazement, "My God, it talks!" The telephone was not alone in its prophetic significance. Thomas Edison displayed his automatic telegraph, hinting at innovations still to come. George Westinghouse showed his air brake system for trains. Heinz offered samples of their ketchup, and the Remington Company introduced the typewriter to a broader public. Each of these items seemed interesting, but not necessarily revolutionary. Yet within 2 decades, telephones and typewriters would become common in offices across the nation, fundamentally altering how business was conducted. Nearly 10 million people attended the Philadelphia exhibition over its 6-month run, many of them traveling by train from distant states, experiencing perhaps their first journey away from home, their first glimpse of a major city, their first encounter with the wider world. The fairgrounds offered not just education and spectacle, but also simple pleasures, lemonade stands and beer gardens, band concerts and fountains, benches where weary visitors could rest and watch the crowds pass by. The exhibition's success emboldened other American cities. Each wanted to demonstrate its own importance, its own claim to cultural and economic significance. New Orleans hosted an exposition in 1884, celebrating the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase and showcasing the recovering South. Chicago began planning even as construction continued, dreaming of something grander than anything yet attempted. But before Chicago could realize its ambitions, Paris would stage the exposition that established the template for all future fairs, that introduced innovations in architecture and engineering that still resonate today, that gave the world an icon that would become synonymous with the city itself. The Exposition Universelle of 1889 marked the centennial of the French Revolution, a celebration both national and international, occupying the Champ de Mars and the surrounding areas, transforming a significant portion of central Paris into exhibition grounds. The centerpiece, the element that dominated every view, that sparked controversy and admiration in equal measure, was Gustave Eiffel's tower. The tower rose 984 feet into the Parisian sky, constructed entirely of wrought iron in an open lattice design that seemed to defy conventional architectural wisdom. Critics called it monstrous, a metal skeleton that ruined the classical beauty of Paris. Artists and writers signed petitions demanding its removal. But the public fell in love. Visitors could ascend by elevator or stairs, climbing through the iron framework, watching the city spread out below them in ever-widening panoramas. From the top platform, on clear days, the view extended for miles, encompassing all of Paris and the countryside beyond. The experience of being so high, of seeing the familiar city from such an unfamiliar perspective, created a sensation that photographs and descriptions could not fully capture. You had to be there, had to feel the slight sway in the wind, had to look down through the open lattice and see the fairgrounds reduced to miniature far below. The Eiffel Tower was meant to be temporary, to stand for the duration of the exhibition and then be dismantled, but it proved too useful. Its height made it perfect for radio transmission experiments, and too beloved, Parisians who had initially protested its construction now defended its preservation. It remained, becoming over time not just a symbol of Paris, but an emblem of human engineering achievement, proof that beauty could emerge from industrial materials and mathematical precision. The 1889 exposition introduced another innovation that would become standard at future fairs. The Gallery of Machines, an enormous hall with a span of 375 feet, featured a moving platform that carried visitors past displays of industrial machinery, allowing them to observe without walking, to cover more ground in less time. The platform moved slowly, matching the pace of a gentle stroll. But the effect was nonetheless magical, as if the exhibition itself were a kind of theater, with visitors as audience members being transported through carefully choreographed scenes. Electric lighting, still relatively novel, illuminated the fairgrounds after dark, turning the evening into another kind of spectacle. The Eiffel Tower glowed with thousands of gas lamps, later replaced by electric lights, becoming a beacon visible from across the city. Fountains played in colored lights. Pavilions were outlined in electric bulbs, and the fair took on a dreamlike quality in the darkness, a temporary city of light and wonder. More than 32 million people attended the Paris Exposition, a staggering number given the population and transportation limitations of the era. Special trains brought visitors from across Europe, and steamships carried Americans and others from more distant shores. The fair ran from May through October, encompassing the entire summer season, allowing ample time for repeat visits, for careful exploration of the countless displays. The national pavilions had grown more elaborate, more architecturally adventurous. Egypt constructed a street of Cairo, complete with shops and cafes and costumed performers, offering visitors an imagined experience of North African life. Though filtered through European expectations and Orientalist fantasies, the Dutch created a village, the Austrians a castle, each nation using architecture to tell a story about itself, to present an identity to the international audience. And there was Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, performing just outside the official exhibition grounds, drawing enormous crowds with its romanticized portrayal of American frontier life. Cowboys and Indians, sharpshooters and bronco riders, reinforcing stereotypes about the American West, even as that frontier was rapidly disappearing. The show's popularity demonstrated the public's hunger not just for industrial progress, but for narrative, for entertainment that told stories and created emotional experiences. Chicago watched Paris's triumph with determination. The young city on Lake Michigan, still recovering from the devastating fire of 1871, wanted to prove that American ambition could match European sophistication, that the New World could create wonders equal to anything the Old World offered. The city bid for the 1893 World's Fair, competing against New York and other established eastern cities, and won, much to the surprise and consternation of those who viewed Chicago as rough and culturally underdeveloped. The World's Columbian Exposition, as it was officially named, commemorated the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, though it opened a year late in 1893. The site chosen was Jackson Park, a marshy area along the lakefront that would require massive landscaping and engineering efforts to transform into suitable exhibition grounds. Daniel Burnham, the chief architect, assembled a team of designers who would create what became known as the White City, a carefully planned ensemble of Grand Beaux-Arts buildings, all painted white, all arranged around lagoons and canals and formal gardens. The architecture deliberately evoked classical Rome, with columns and domes and ornate decoration, creating a vision of harmonious civic beauty that contrasted sharply with the industrial chaos and grime of Chicago's actual neighborhoods. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building covered 31 acres, making it the largest building in the world at that time, large enough to require its own internal transportation system. Its roof arched 150 feet above the floor, supported by enormous iron trusses, creating an interior space so vast that weather patterns could form inside. Mist rising from the displays on humid mornings. But for all the grandeur of the White City, the exposition's most revolutionary contribution stood apart from the classical ensemble along a strip called the Midway Plaisance, a boulevard connecting Jackson Park to Washington Park. The fair's entertainment zone emerged. Here, the high-minded educational purpose of the main exhibition grounds gave way to something more frankly commercial, more openly entertaining. Concessions offered exotic foods and performances. The streets of Cairo featured belly dancers. The Javanese village displayed traditional crafts. The Irish village sold lace and whiskey. Each concession presented a simplified, often stereotyped version of a culture, designed to amuse and intrigue rather than to educate with nuance. And rising above the Midway, dominating the skyline, turning slowly against the clouds, stood George Ferris's wheel, 264 feet in diameter, carrying 36 wooden cars that each held 60 passengers. The Ferris wheel answered the Eiffel Tower's challenge. America could build wonders too, could create experiences that inspired awe and delight. The wheel turned slowly, taking 20 minutes to complete a full rotation, carrying passengers high above the fairgrounds, offering views of the White City and Lake Michigan and the sprawling city beyond. Riding the Ferris wheel became almost obligatory, a required experience for anyone visiting the exposition. Passengers crowded into the cars, felt the gentle sway as the wheel lifted them skyward, watched the fair spread out below in ever-increasing detail. The experience combined thrill with tranquility, a slow ascent that built anticipation, a pause at the summit where the view seemed to stretch forever, and then the gradual descent back to earth. More than 27 million people attended the Columbian Exposition, nearly half the population of the United States at that time. They came by train from every state, spent days or weeks exploring the fairgrounds, carried home memories that would last lifetimes. For many, particularly those from rural areas, the exposition offered their first encounter with electricity, their first ride on a moving sidewalk, their first taste of foods from distant cultures, their first glimpse of artwork from European masters. The success of Chicago's White City established expectations that would shape world's fairs for the next half-century. Every subsequent exposition would need its iconic structure, its architectural signature, something that could be photographed and remembered, something that announced the fair's significance before a single visitor passed through the gates. Buffalo hosted the Pan American Exposition in 1901, featuring buildings painted in brilliant colors, yellows and oranges and reds, a deliberate contrast to Chicago's white classicism. The fair's centerpiece was the Electric Tower, rising 375 feet above the fairgrounds, covered in lights that made it glow like a beacon after dark. The entire exposition celebrated electricity, with more electrical illumination than had ever been concentrated in one place. creating nighttime spectacles that drew crowds who simply wanted to stand and stare at the brilliance. But Buffalo is remembered now for tragedy more than triumph. President William McKinley attended the fair in early September, shaking hands with visitors in the Temple of Music, when an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz approached with a concealed revolver and fired twice. McKinley died 8 days later, and the exposition, which had been meant to celebrate progress and hemispheric cooperation, became instead the site of national mourning. The tragedy did not stop the momentum of World's Fairs. If anything, it seemed to intensify the desire to gather, to celebrate, to demonstrate that violence and darkness could not extinguish the spirit of innovation and cooperation. St. Louis took its turn in 1904, commemorating the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase with an exposition that sprawled across Forest Park and the surrounding grounds. The fair was enormous, larger than any previous American exposition, with 1,500 acres of exhibits and attractions. The Palace of Electricity alone covered 9 acres, filled with dynamos and generators and demonstrations of how electrical power could transform daily life. The St. Louis Fair introduced the world to ice cream cones, though the exact origins remain disputed, and popularized iced tea, served cold to combat the oppressive summer heat. These culinary innovations, small in themselves, demonstrated how fairs served as testing grounds for commercial products, places where businesses could gauge public reaction and generate publicity. The Philippine reservation at St. Louis covered 47 acres, displaying 1,200 Filipinos from various ethnic groups, living in reconstructed villages, performing traditional activities for crowds of spectators. The exhibit was explicitly colonial, designed to justify American occupation of the islands by portraying Filipinos as primitive peoples who needed American guidance and civilization. The racism was blatant and intentional, part of a larger pattern in which World's Fairs presented non-European peoples as curiosities or examples of evolutionary backwardness. This darker aspect of World's Fairs grew more pronounced in the early 20th century, even as the exhibitions celebrated enlightenment and progress. Human zoos, as they came to be called, featured prominently at fairs in Brussels and Paris and elsewhere, reducing living people to displays, reinforcing hierarchies of race and culture that justified colonial exploitation. The same events that showcased technological marvels also perpetuated profound injustices, demonstrating the contradictions embedded in these celebrations of human achievement. San Francisco rose from the ashes of the 1906 earthquake to host the Panama Pacific International Exposition in 1915, celebrating the completion of the Panama Canal and the city's own recovery. The fair occupied reclaimed land along the waterfront, with buildings in a romantic Spanish colonial style, pastel colors and red tile roofs, gardens filled with flowers and palm trees, creating an atmosphere more relaxed and pleasure-oriented than the grand classical statements of earlier fairs. The Tower of Jewels rose above the fair, covered with more than 100,000 glass gems called Nova Gems, which captured and reflected light, creating a shimmering effect that changed throughout the day. At night, searchlights played across the tower, making the jewels sparkle like stars. The effect was magical, transformative, turning architecture into something alive and dynamic. But the shadow of war hung over the San Francisco Exposition, Europe was already embroiled in the conflict that would become known as the Great War. And while the United States remained neutral for the moment, the absence of major European participants gave the fair a hollow feeling. Germany had planned an elaborate pavilion, but withdrew. France and Britain sent only modest displays, their resources diverted to the war effort. After the war ended, the world's fairs continued, but something had shifted. The boundless optimism of the Victorian and Edwardian eras had been shattered by the mechanized slaughter of the trenches. Progress no longer seemed an unalloyed good when it produced poison gas and aerial bombardment. The relationship between technology and human welfare had grown more complicated, more ambiguous. The Paris Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes in 1925 gave the world a new term, Art Deco. Derived from the exhibition's name, the fair celebrated modern design, sleek lines and geometric patterns, luxury and craftsmanship applied to contemporary forms. It was smaller than the grand universal expositions, more focused, but influential in shaping aesthetic sensibilities for the next 2 decades. Chicago returned to the World's Fair stage in 1933, marking the city's centennial with the Century of Progress Exposition. The fair ran for 2 seasons, drawing millions despite the depths of the Great Depression, offering a vision of technological optimism at a moment when faith in the future seemed scarce. The architecture broke decisively with classical tradition, embracing modernist principles, buildings painted in bold colors, streamlined forms that suggested speed and efficiency, structures designed around steel frames and prefabricated panels. The fair's motto was, "Science finds, industry applies, man conforms," a phrase that captured both the technocratic confidence of the era and an unsettling vision of human adaptation to technological imperatives. Exhibits demonstrated air conditioning and diesel engines, the latest advances in chemistry and manufacturing. Television appeared in experimental form, showing fuzzy images that hinted at future possibilities. The skyride carried visitors in rocket-shaped cars suspended from cables, crossing the fairgrounds high above the crowds, offering another new perspective, another way of seeing, but it was the New York World's Fair of 1939 that would define the genre for a generation, that would create images and memories that still resonate, that would offer a vision of tomorrow that seemed both attainable and impossibly distant. The fair opened in Flushing Meadows, Queens, on land that had been a notorious ash dump, transformed through massive earth-moving and landscaping into a respectable exhibition ground. The theme was the world of tomorrow, and every element of the fair pointed toward the future, toward a streamlined, technologically advanced world where machines would eliminate drudgery and abundance would be universal, and the Trilon and Perisphere became the fair's symbols, a 700-foot spike rising beside a 200-foot diameter sphere, both painted gleaming white, both utterly modern in their geometric purity. Inside the Perisphere, visitors descended on escalators to view Democracy, a model of a planned city of the future where rational design would create harmony and efficiency, where highways and housing and industry would be integrated in perfect balance. General Motors presented Futurama, designed by Norman Bell Geddes, a vision of America in 1960. Visitors sat in moving chairs that carried them above an enormous diorama. looking down on a landscape of superhighways and modern cities, of controlled access expressways that would eliminate traffic congestion, of clean industrial parks and suburban developments. The vision was seductive, progress rendered in miniature. A future that seemed both logical and desirable, waiting just 20 years ahead. The RCA Pavilion demonstrated television, still experimental but clearly destined for commercial development. Visitors could see themselves on screen, an experience that was simultaneously thrilling and slightly unsettling, watching their own image broadcast through invisible waves. The implications for communication and entertainment were obvious, though few could have predicted the medium's eventual cultural dominance. The fair drew millions over its 2 seasons, 1939 and 1940. But the shadow of war grew darker each month. Hitler had invaded Poland in September of 1939, even as the fair continued its celebration of peaceful progress. By the time the fair closed in October 1940, much of Europe was at war, and the United States was edging closer to involvement. The future imagined at Flushing Meadows, that streamlined world of prosperity and harmony, would have to wait. After World War II, the world's fairs resumed, but they evolved in character and purpose. Brussels hosted Expo 58, featuring the atomium, a structure representing an iron crystal magnified 165 billion times. The building reflected the atomic age's fascination with fundamental structures, with the invisible forces that shaped matter and energy. It was futuristic and optimistic, presenting nuclear power as a force for peace and progress rather than destruction. Seattle's Century 21 exposition in 1962 gave the city its Space Needle, a structure that captured the space age enthusiasm of the Kennedy years. The fair celebrated science and space exploration, looking upward rather than merely forward, imagining a future among the stars. New York hosted another World's Fair in 1964, returning to Flushing Meadows with another vision of tomorrow. The Unisphere stood at the fair's center, a steel globe 120 feet in diameter, representing global interdependence and the space age. IBM and General Electric and other corporations created elaborate pavilions using emerging technologies like computers and animatronics to create immersive experiences. Walt Disney contributed several attractions, including It's a Small World, a boat ride featuring hundreds of singing animatronic children, representing unity through cultural diversity. The attraction was simultaneously charming and somewhat eerie, its relentless optimism and simplified cultural representations reflecting both the best intentions and the limitations of the era's internationalism. But even as these fairs attracted millions, the format was beginning to feel dated. Television and jet travel had made the world more accessible. The wonders that once required a journey to a fairground could now be encountered through other means. The unique role that World's Fairs had played, bringing distant places and future possibilities within reach of ordinary people, was diminishing. Montreal's Expo 67 marked perhaps the last truly successful fair in the grand tradition, celebrating Canada's centennial. The exposition occupied islands in the St. Lawrence River, with pavilions designed by leading architects from around the world. The United States built Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome, a soaring sphere of interconnected triangles. Habitat 67 showcased modular housing, concrete blocks stacked in irregular patterns, suggesting new approaches to urban living. More than 50 million people attended Expo 67, drawn by the architecture and the optimism, by the sense that the fair captured a particular moment of possibility. The 60s were still mostly hopeful in 1967. The darker turns of 1968 and beyond had not yet arrived, and the fair reflected that brief window when technology and culture and internationalism seemed aligned toward positive ends. After Montreal, the decline became clear. Osaka in 1970 drew enormous crowds in Japan, but made little international impact. Spokane in 1974 was modest in scale, focused on environmental themes, but lacking the grandeur of earlier fairs. New Orleans in 1984 struggled financially, demonstrating that the economic model of World's Fairs had become unsustainable. The reasons were multiple and interconnected. Rising costs made the massive construction projects difficult to justify. Television and later the internet provided easier access to information and spectacle. Tourism had become global, making the educational component of fairs less unique, and perhaps most significantly, the narrative of inevitable progress that had sustained World's Fairs for more than a century had frayed. The late 20th century brought environmental awareness and post-colonial critique, technological skepticism, and cultural complexity, making the optimistic certainties of earlier fairs seem naive or even dangerous. Yet the tradition persisted, evolved, adapted. The Bureau International des Expositions in Paris continued to sanction official World's Fairs, now called Expos, every few years. Seville in 1992, Lisbon in 1998, Hanover in 2000, Shanghai in 2010. Each attempted to address contemporary concerns, sustainability, cultural diversity, digital technology. But they no longer occupied the central cultural position they once held. They had become one option among many, interesting perhaps, but no longer essential. And yet, there is something worth considering about what these gatherings represented, something beyond the buildings and the inventions, beyond the nationalism and the commerce. They were attempts to make the abstract tangible, to give physical form to the idea of human progress, to create spaces where the entire sweep of achievement could be witnessed in a single day. A farmer from Iowa could stand before machinery from Germany. A shopkeeper from Paris could taste tea from Ceylon. A child from any nation could watch electric lights banish darkness. And in those moments, something shifted. The world became smaller, more comprehensible, more connected. The fairs existed in a curious temporal space. They looked backward, celebrating what had been accomplished, showcasing the journey from past to present, but they also looked forward, presenting prototypes and possibilities, offering glimpses of what might soon become commonplace. A visitor in 1851 could see the telegraph connecting distant cities. Someone in 1939 could watch television broadcasts, experiencing technologies that would reshape their world within their lifetimes. And always, there was the architecture, those temporary cities built for wonder. The buildings were never meant to last. Most were constructed of plaster and wood, designed to stand for 6 months, perhaps a year, and then be demolished. Their impermanence was essential to their nature. They could be fantastical, excessive, experimental, precisely because they didn't need to endure. An architect could design a palace of machinery or a tower of light without worrying about maintenance costs or long-term structural integrity. The buildings existed to create impressions, to generate memories, to serve as backdrops for the performances of progress. Yet some refused to disappear. The Eiffel Tower was meant to be temporary, but became permanent. The Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco survived its exposition and still stands, transformed into a museum and public space. These structures that outlasted their intended purpose became monuments to the fairs themselves, physical reminders of gatherings that otherwise vanished completely. The gardens deserve mention, too. The landscapes that surrounded the exhibition halls. Frederick Law Olmsted designed the grounds for the Chicago Fair, creating lagoons and islands, planting thousands of trees and flowers, using landscape as an integral part of the experience. Visitors could rest in carefully designed natural settings, could move between the dense stimulus of the exhibition halls and the calmer contemplation of gardens and waterways. The landscape design recognized that spectacle required balance, that wonder could be exhausting, that beauty took many forms. And there were always fountains, water features that caught light and created sound, that provided focal points and gathering spaces. The Columbian Fountain in Chicago, the Electric Fountain in Buffalo, countless others whose names are forgotten, but whose presence shaped the fairground experience, water in motion, catching sunlight, offering visual interest that required no explanation or context, simply beautiful for its own sake. The music, too, live, orchestras, and military bands, performances from visiting musicians, national anthems and popular songs, creating an auditory landscape as rich as the visual one. Before recordings became ubiquitous, live music was the only kind, and the fairs employed hundreds of musicians, creating soundscapes that varied from building to building, from hour to hour. The experience of moving through the fairgrounds was simultaneously visual and auditory, a multimedia experience before that term existed. The food, already mentioned, but worth returning to, the mixing of cuisines, the introduction of exotic flavors, the democratization of tastes that had once been available only to the wealthy or well-traveled. A World's Fair could be someone's first encounter with coffee from Brazil, chocolate from Switzerland, spices from India. These tastes carried associations, connected to places and cultures, turned abstract geography into sensory experience. And what of the people themselves, the millions who attended? What did they carry away? Some found inspiration for careers, seeing machinery or artwork that shaped their ambitions. Engineers and artists and scientists who trace their vocations to a childhood visit to a World's Fair. Others found broader perspectives, realizing that their own culture was one among many, that different approaches to art and architecture and daily life were equally valid. For some, the fairs challenged prejudices, though they reinforced them for others. The fairgrounds created temporary communities. Strangers walked together, shared wonder and exhaustion, exchanged observations and reactions. For a few hours or days, people from vastly different backgrounds occupied the same space, pursued the same goal of seeing everything, experiencing everything. They were not equal. Class and race and nationality created hierarchies even on the fairgrounds, but they were more mixed than in most contexts, more likely to encounter difference. The photographs that survive, faded images of crowds and buildings, capture something of this. The formal architectural shots show empty plazas and pristine facades, but the candid images reveal masses of people, women in long skirts and elaborate hats, men in suits despite the summer heat, children pressing close to their parents, everyone dressed in their finest, treating the fair as an occasion that demanded respect and formality. And at night, when the electric lights transformed everything, when the buildings glowed and the fountains played in colored illumination, when the fairgrounds became something magical and unreal, the nighttime fair was different from the daytime version, more romantic, more mysterious. The harsh details softened in the glow, the crowds thinned slightly, and walking the grounds after dark became an experience unto itself, a kind of dream made visible. The world's fairs were always about imagination, about the capacity to envision something different and then build it, however briefly. They required faith that people would come, that they would care, that the effort and expense of creating these temporary wonderlands would prove worthwhile. And for more than a century, that faith was repeatedly validated. Millions came. Memories were made. The culture was shaped by these gatherings in ways subtle and profound. Now the fairs continue in altered form, smaller perhaps, more focused on specific themes, sustainability, or digital innovation or cultural exchange. They happen in cities around the world, Dubai and Milan and Osaka, drawing visitors who are often more interested in the national pavilions than in grand unifying narratives about progress. The age of world's fairs as major cultural events has perhaps passed, replaced by other forms of global gathering, by the Internet's constant connectivity, by the ease of international travel that makes experiencing other cultures directly more accessible. The unique role they played, that combination of education and entertainment, that physical gathering of the world's achievements in one place, is harder to justify in an era of instant information and virtual presence. And yet, there is something lost, something that cannot be replaced by screens or jet travel. The fairgrounds created experiences that were simultaneously individual and collective. You walked through alone or with companions, following your own interests and curiosities, but you did so surrounded by thousands of others engaged in the same quest. You encountered wonders designed specifically to create that sense of encounter, arranged and displayed with care and intention, curated to tell stories about nations and technologies and possibilities. The temporary nature of it all added poignancy. You knew it wouldn't last, that in a few months the buildings would come down, the exhibits would disperse, the grounds would return to their previous purpose. This knowledge shaped the experience, made each visit feel precious, created urgency to see everything before the opportunity vanished. The photographs and souvenirs people carried home, the postcards and medallions and programs. These became more than mementos. They were proof that the experience had been real, that those magical buildings had actually stood, that the wonders witnessed had not been imagined. In an era before casual photography, before everyone carried cameras, these official images documented not just the fairs but entire trips, entire life experiences. Some visitors returned again and again, unable to exhaust the possibilities in a single day or even a dozen visits. They became students of the fairgrounds, knew the best routes through the crowds, had favorite pavilions they visited repeatedly, formed relationships with the place that were almost intimate. finding comfort in the familiar even as they continued discovering the new. And when the fairs closed, when the final day arrived and the gates shut for the last time, there must have been a particular kind of melancholy, a temporary city that had become beloved, that had occupied thoughts and conversations for months, was suddenly gone. The site would be cleared, the materials salvaged or destroyed, and only memory would remain. Those memories, though, they persisted. Grandparents told stories of the White City or the Trilon and Perisphere, showed faded photographs to children and grandchildren, kept the experience alive through retelling. The fairs became part of family histories, markers of time and experience, touchstones for understanding an era. Tonight we have walked through vanished landscapes, traced pathways that no longer exist, except in archives and imagination. We have stood before buildings that fell to wrecking crews decades ago, watched fountains that have long since stopped flowing. The world's fairs exist now primarily as echoes, as cultural memory, as proof that humanity has repeatedly gathered to celebrate its achievements and imagine its future. The glass palaces have shattered. The electric towers are dark. The Ferris wheels have stopped turning. But the impulse that created them, the desire to gather and share and wonder, that remains, taking different forms perhaps, finding new expressions, but still fundamentally the same. And somewhere tonight, plans are being drawn for the next exposition, architects sketching pavilions, organizers imagining themes, continuing a tradition that stretches back more than a century and a half, still believing that bringing people together, showing them wonders, creating spaces for encounter and imagination, still matters. The fairgrounds may be empty now, returned to parks or redeveloped into neighborhoods, but they were real once. They stood solid and magnificent, drew millions, created memories that lasted lifetimes, and that, perhaps, is enough to have existed, to have mattered, to have given people moments of wonder in an often difficult world. These temporary cities accomplished that again and again, before fading like dreams in morning light, leaving only stories, only echoes, only the quiet knowledge that such places once existed. And for those who saw them, nothing was ever quite the same. There is a place where voices rise and fall like the movement of light through stained glass, where sound becomes architecture, and where the human voice is asked to do something impossible, to become an instrument more precise than any carved from wood or brass, more expressive than any drawn bow across strings. This is the world of opera, a world that has existed for more than 4 centuries, weaving itself through the great halls of Europe and beyond, through revolution and restoration, through candlelight and electric glow, through the voices of those who trained for years to master an art form that asks everything of the body and the spirit. Tonight, I find myself thinking about those voices, the ones that filled theaters when kings still ruled, the ones that echoed through revolution, the ones that carried stories of gods and mortals, of love found and lost, of tragedy that felt almost unbearably human despite this grandeur of the staging. Opera is not one thing, but many things woven together: music and drama, costume and light, orchestra and human voice, all conspiring to create something that exists only in the moment of performance, something that dissolves into memory even as it unfolds. I imagine the first audiences, gathered in rooms not yet called theaters, listening to something they had never quite heard before, a sung drama that was trying to resurrect what the ancient Greeks might have done, trying to breathe life into fragments of plays where the music had been lost to time, where only the words remained, like vessels waiting to be filled. The air in those early rooms must have felt charged with possibility, with the strange thrill of watching something new come into being, something that would grow and change and spread across continents, that would survive wars and plagues and the rise and fall of empires, that would give us Mozart and Verdi and Wagner, Puccini and Bizet, voices that would echo through centuries. And it all began with a question, a curiosity about what theater might have been in ancient times, when drama was sung as much as spoken, when the chorus moved in formation, when masks transformed performers into archetypes, into figures larger than life. The late Renaissance, a time when scholars and artists looked backward to move forward, when the classical world felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved, when every fragment of ancient text was studied, debated, reimagined, and in those debates, in those gatherings of musicians and poets and theorists, something unexpected emerged. They called themselves the Camerata, these men who met in Florence, in rooms filled with books and instruments, rooms where conversation could stretch long into the night, where ideas about music and drama could be tested, refined, transformed into something that could be staged, something that could be heard. What they were seeking was monody, a style of singing that would allow the text to be understood, that would let the natural rhythms of speech shape the melody, that would make the words as important as the music, perhaps more important, a reversal of the polyphonic complexity that had dominated sacred and secular music, where multiple voices wove together in patterns so intricate that individual words could disappear into the texture. They wanted clarity, emotion, drama. They wanted the singer to move an audience the way an actor could, to make them weep or tremble or sit forward in their seats, and to do this through music that served the story rather than overwhelming it. And so the first operas were born, hesitant experiments that would grow into something magnificent, something that would define entire eras of musical culture, that would create legends and launch careers, that would fill opera houses from Venice to Vienna, from Paris to New York, from Moscow to Buenos Aires. I think of those early composers writing for voices and small ensembles, creating works for special occasions, for wealthy patrons, for celebrations and ceremonies, not yet knowing that they were laying the foundation for an art form that would outlive them by centuries, that would evolve in ways they could never have imagined. The music they wrote was simpler than what would come, more restrained, but it carried something essential, the seed of everything that followed, the understanding that music could heighten drama, that a sung line could carry emotional weight that speech alone could not, that an orchestra could underscore and amplify the inner life of a character. The first opera that history remembers clearly emerged in the year 1600, a work called Euridice, composed by Jacopo Peri for the wedding of Maria de' Medici and King Henry IV of France, a celebration that brought together the most powerful families of Europe and required entertainment befitting such an occasion. Peri was not working alone. He collaborated with Giulio Caccini, another composer who understood this new style of dramatic singing, and together they set to music a version of the Orpheus myth, that ancient story of a poet-musician who descends into the underworld to retrieve his beloved wife, only to lose her again through a moment of doubt. The myth was perfect for this new form. It was about music's power, about a voice so moving it could soften the hearts of gods, could make the stones weep, could pause the wheel of suffering. And in setting it to music, the composers were demonstrating the very power the story described. But Eurydice was not the only early opera, not even the first. There had been Daphne, composed by Perry a few years earlier, around 1598, though that work is mostly lost to us now, surviving only in fragments and descriptions. Like so many things from that era, when music existed in performance and in handwritten scores that could be lost to fire or flood or simple neglect. What we know is that these early works were intimate affairs, performed for select audiences in palace rooms, accompanied by small ensembles, perhaps a harpsichord, some string instruments, a theorbo with its long neck and deep resonant tones, the singers standing or moving simply, their voices carrying the drama with minimal staging. The style they used was called recitative, a kind of musical speech that followed the natural inflections of Italian, rising and fallings with the meaning of the words, allowing the text to be heard clearly, to be understood. This was crucial because the whole project depended on the audience being moved by the story, by the poetry, by the marriage of word and tone. And then came Monteverdi, Claudio Monteverdi, a composer who had already revolutionized secular vocal music with his madrigals, those intricate polyphonic settings of poetry that pushed at the boundaries of Renaissance harmony, that used dissonance in ways that shocked conservative listeners, that made music feel modern and urgent and alive. Monteverdi's L'Orfeo premiered in 1607 in Mantua at the court of Duke Vincenzo Gonzaga, and it changed everything. This was opera finding its full voice, discovering what it could be when a composer of genius turned his attention to the form. The score called for an orchestra of around 40 instruments, astonishing for the time, including trumpets and trombones, recorders and cornets, strings of various sizes, organs and harpsichords, creating a palette of colors that could shift with the drama, that could evoke the pastoral beauty of Thrace, where Orpheus sang, or the dark mystery of the underworld where he descended. Monteverdi understood that music could do more than accompany the text. It could embody emotion, could create atmosphere, could make an audience feel the joy of Orpheus's wedding day, the crushing weight of Eurydice's death, the desperate hope of his journey to retrieve her, the anguish of losing her again. The role of Orpheus required a singer who could navigate both the lyrical beauty of the shepherd songs and the dramatic intensity of the underworld scenes, someone who could make the audience believe in the power of music, because Orpheus wins Eurydice back not through strength or cunning, but through song, through a voice so pure and heartbreaking that even death must yield. L'Orfeo was followed by other works. Monteverdi continued composing operas, including L'Arianna, of which only the famous lament survives, a piece so moving that contemporary accounts describe audiences weeping openly, unable to contain their emotion at the music's power. And opera began to spread, from the courts to the cities, from private performance to public spectacle. Venice became the center of this transformation. In 1637, the first public opera house opened there, San Cassiano, where anyone who could afford a ticket could attend, where opera became not just entertainment for the aristocracy, but a phenomenon accessible to merchants and professionals, to anyone drawn by the promise of drama and music combined. Venice was the perfect city for this development, a republic of merchants, wealthy from trade, filled with visitors from across Europe, a city that loved spectacle and celebration, that held elaborate festivals, that understood the value of public entertainment. And the Venetian opera houses multiplied, more than a dozen by the end of the 17th century, each competing for audiences, each trying to outdo the others with more spectacular productions. The stories evolved too, moving beyond the pastoral myths of the earliest operas, embracing historical subjects, romantic comedies, tales of intrigue and mistaken identity, whatever would draw crowds and keep them coming back. Opera was becoming commercial, and that changed its nature, made it more varied, more responsive to popular taste. Composers wrote prolifically, sometimes producing several operas in a single year. Music that was meant to be performed a few times and then replaced with something new, though certain works caught on. Certain arias became favorites that audiences demanded to hear again and again. The singers became stars, celebrated and sought after, especially the castrati, the male singers who had been castrated before puberty to preserve their high vocal range, creating voices that combined the power and breath control of adult lungs with the flexibility and brilliance of a soprano or mezzo-soprano, voices unlike anything else in nature. These singers commanded enormous fees, had followers who came just to hear them, who threw flowers and poems onto the stage, who memorized their favorite arias. The castrati were among the first true celebrities of the modern world. Their portraits painted and sold, their lives followed with the kind of attention we might now reserve for film stars. But there was darkness in this too. The practice of castration was officially forbidden by the church. Yet it continued. Boys from poor families offered up in the hope that a spectacular voice might bring wealth and fame. Though for every successful castrato, there were dozens who never achieved stardom, who were left with altered bodies and modest careers in church choirs. The ethics of it troubled some even then, but the sound was considered celestial, angelic, unlike anything that natural voices could produce, and audiences were willing to overlook the human cost for the sake of that unearthly beauty. Opera also spread beyond Italy to France, where it took on a different character under the influence of Jean-Baptiste Lully, an Italian-born composer who became the master of French opera, who understood that the French language required different musical treatment than Italian, that French audiences wanted dance integrated into their operas, wanted spectacle and machines, transformations and flying gods. Lully created tragédie lyrique, a distinctly French form that combined singing with elaborate ballet sequences that drew on classical subjects but treated them with French formality and elegance, that featured prologues praising King Louis XIV, connecting the mythological past to the glorious present of the Sun King's reign. The Paris Opera became an institution, its productions lavish beyond anything seen in Italy, with machinery that could create storms and transformations, that could make gods descend from the heavens or sea monsters rise from the depths. Opera as total spectacle, as demonstration of royal power and artistic sophistication. Meanwhile, in England, opera struggled to take hold. The English had their own theatrical traditions, the spoken drama of Shakespeare and his successors, and they seemed resistant to the idea of sung drama, preferring plays with occasional songs, masques, and semi-operas rather than works that were sung throughout. Henry Purcell composed Dido and Aeneas around 1689, a masterpiece in miniature, an opera that runs barely an hour but contains some of the most moving music of the Baroque era. Dido's final lament, "When I am laid in earth," is a piece of such profound sadness, such acceptance of inevitable death, that it transcends its era and its context, becoming something universal. But Purcell's genius was not enough to establish English opera as a tradition. After his early death, opera in England meant Italian opera, works imported from the continent, sung in Italian by Italian singers for English audiences who might not understand the words, but who came for the music, for the spectacle, for the social occasion of attending the opera. Back in Italy, in Naples, a new style was developing, opera seria, serious opera, with stricter conventions, alternating recitative and aria, the recitative advancing the plot through musical speech, the aria stopping time to explore a single emotion, to give the singer a chance to display virtuosity, to move the audience with elaborate melodic lines and dramatic expression. The librettos, the texts, often came from poets like Metastasio, who wrote the same stories over and over, tales from ancient history, from mythology, stories of noble sacrifice and moral virtue, and different composers would set the same libretto to music, creating different versions, allowing audiences to compare approaches, to debate which composer had best captured the drama, which had written the most beautiful arias. The arias themselves followed patterns. The da capo aria became standard, a three-part form where the opening section returned after a contrasting middle, but the return was not exact. The singer was expected to ornament it, to add flourishes and variations, to demonstrate skill and creativity, turning the written notes into something personal, something spontaneous despite the formal structure. This was opera as it existed through most of the 18th century, a living tradition that evolved but maintained certain core principles, that valued the voice above all, that understood drama as a vehicle for musical expression, that gave us Handel and Vivaldi, Porpora and Hasse, composers whose names were famous across Europe, whose operas drew crowds and launched careers, and created the musical landscape of the Enlightenment. And then there was Handel, George Friedrich Handel, a German composer who made his name in Italy and his fortune in England, writing operas that combined Italian virtuosity with a dramatic power that went beyond convention, that made audiences feel the weight of every decision, every betrayal, every moment of heroism or despair. Handel wrote more than 40 operas, works like Giulio Cesare and Rinaldo, Alcina and Ariodante, each one a marvel of melodic invention, filled with arias that could break your heart or set it soaring. Music that understood the human voice as an instrument capable of expressing the subtlest gradations of feeling. In Giulio Cesare, composed in 1724, the role of Caesar requires a singer who can portray both warrior and lover, who can navigate music of tremendous technical difficulty while making it seem effortless, natural, the overflow of emotion rather than the demonstration of skill, and the role of Cleopatra moves from playful seduction to genuine passion to desperate grief, all traced in music that follows her transformation. The opera houses of London were filled with intrigue, rival companies competing for audiences, importing the greatest singers from Italy, paying them astronomical sums, creating celebrity rivalries that became public spectacles, audiences taking sides, debates in coffee houses about which soprano was superior, which castrato had the more affecting voice. There was Faustina Bordoni and Francesca Cuzzoni, two sopranos whose rivalry became legendary, who once came to blows on stage, pulling hair and tearing costumes while the audience cheered and took bets. Opera as blood sport, as entertainment that went beyond the music into the realm of scandal and gossip. But beneath the scandal, beneath the commerce and competition, there was always the music, arias of such beauty that they have survived 3 centuries, that are still sung today, still moving audiences who know nothing of the original context, who respond simply to the marriage of voice and melody, to the way Handel could write a line that seemed to float effortlessly upward, that seemed to hang suspended before descending in phrases that felt inevitable, perfect. The castrato Senesino was one of Handel's greatest interpreters, a singer whose voice was described as powerful yet flexible, capable of heroic declamation and tender lyricism. He created many of Handel's greatest roles, brought them to life in ways that shaped how the composer wrote, because opera was always a collaboration between composer and singer, the music written for specific voices, tailored to their strengths, incorporating the ornaments and variations they preferred. But tastes were changing, even as Handel continued writing Italian operas. The English audience was growing restless, wanting entertainment in their own language, wanting satire and commentary on contemporary life, rather than ancient history and mythology, and this opened the door for a new form, the ballad opera, which used popular tunes with new words, which mocked the conventions of Italian opera even as it borrowed its structure. The Beggar's Opera premiered in 1728, with a libretto by John Gay and music arranged by Johann Christoph Pepusch, and it was a sensation, running for 62 performances, an unprecedented success that satirized both Italian opera and the government of Robert Walpole, using thieves and prostitutes as its characters instead of kings and heroes, setting their stories to familiar ballads instead of elaborate arias. Handel's opera company struggled after this, audiences dwindling, debts mounting, but he was nothing if not resilient. He shifted his focus to oratorio, to dramatic works in English based on biblical subjects, works that could be performed in concert without the expense of staging, and in this form he found even greater success, creating masterpieces like Messiah and Saul, works that brought the dramatic power of opera to sacred subjects. Meanwhile, in Vienna, in the court of the Habsburg emperors, opera seria continued to flourish. Metastasio served as court poet, writing librettos that would be set hundreds of times by different composers, and the imperial theaters presented lavish productions for celebrations and feast days, opera as an expression of imperial power and cultural refinement. The singers who performed in Vienna were among the best in Europe. The castrato Caffarelli, whose voice was said to have a range of more than 3 octaves, who could execute the most difficult passages with apparent ease, whose performances left audiences stunned, and Farinelli, perhaps the most famous castrato of all, whose voice was described as superhuman, who could sustain a note longer than seemed physically possible, who could execute trills and runs that defied belief. Farinelli's career took him from Venice to London to Madrid, where he became the favorite of King Philip V, singing the same 4 arias every night for the melancholic king, using music as a kind of therapy, a balm for the king's troubled mind. This was opera's power recognized at the highest levels, music as medicine, as necessity, as something that could reach parts of the human soul that nothing else could touch. But even as opera seria dominated the great courts, another form was developing, opera buffa, comic opera, which had started as short interludes performed between the acts of serious operas, light relief from the heavy emotions of tragedy, but which gradually developed into full-length works with their own conventions and appeal. Opera buffa used everyday characters, servants and merchants, young lovers trying to outwit their parents, old men made foolish by love, situations that could be funny and touching by turns, music that was tuneful and direct, accessible in a way that opera seria sometimes was not, with its elaborate vocal display and its focus on noble suffering. Pergolesi's La Serva Padrona, composed in 1733, is one of the earliest and most delightful examples, a short work about a servant girl who tricks her master into marrying her, using music that sparkles with wit and charm, that moves quickly, that makes you smile at the sheer cleverness of the manipulation, the way the characters play off each other in duets that feel like musical conversations. This form would prove enormously influential, would give us the great Mozart operas of the 1780s. But we are not there yet. We are still in the middle decades of the 18th century, when opera was everywhere in Europe, when every court of any significance had its opera house, its company of singers, its maestro di cappella, composing new works for each season. The work of creating an opera was collaborative and intense. The composer would receive a libretto, often a text that had been set before, and would begin setting it to music, writing recitatives that moved the plot along, then arias for each character, showcasing their vocal abilities, highlighting their role in the drama. The recitative was usually accompanied only by harpsichord and cello, a sparse texture that allowed the words to be heard clearly, but at moments of high drama, at crucial turning points, the composer might write accompanied recitative with the full orchestra playing, creating tension and emotional weight, preparing for the aria that would follow. And the aria was where time stopped, where the character could express a single emotion fully, anger or love, revenge or forgiveness. The music often in 3 parts, an opening section, then a contrasting middle that might offer a different perspective, then the return of the opening, but elaborated, ornamented, the singer making it their own. The orchestra sat in the pit, strings forming the core, usually violins divided into 2 sections, violas, cellos, basses, creating a warm foundation, then winds added color, oboes bright and pastoral, flutes lighter and more ethereal, bassoons providing bass line and sometimes comic effects, and for special moments, horns bringing a suggestion of the hunt, of outdoor space, of nobility and ceremony. The theater itself was a social space, boxes arranged in tiers around the auditorium, each box a small room where noble families could entertain, could be seen, could observe not just the stage but each other. Opera as social ritual, as display of status and taste, the pit filled with a more boisterous crowd, students and merchants, people who might talk during the recitatives, but who would quiet down for the famous arias, who would applaud and call for encores, who would make or break a singer's reputation. The stage was lit by candles, hundreds of them, creating a warm glow but also a fire hazard. Theaters burned with disturbing regularity, taking with them sets and costumes, sometimes even lives, the danger accepted as part of the spectacle. The thrill of live performance always tinged with risk. Sets were painted in perspective, creating illusions of depth, of grand palaces or pastoral landscapes, of temples and gardens and throne rooms, changed between acts by stage hands working in full view of the audience, or sometimes hidden behind the next set already in place, sliding into view as the previous one was pulled away. Machinery above the stage allowing gods to descend on clouds, creating moments of wonder that audiences demanded, that were part of opera's appeal. This combination of music and visual spectacle, of things that seemed impossible, made manifest. Composers worked quickly. An opera might be written in a matter of weeks, rehearsed briefly, performed for a season, and then retired, making way for the next work. This was not music intended for the ages, not yet. This was entertainment, commercial art created to fill theaters, to satisfy patrons, to give singers vehicles for their talents, yet some of it endured. Some arias became so popular they were sung outside the theater, arranged for other instruments, published and sold as sheet music, spreading across Europe through amateur musicians who wanted to play the latest melodies, who wanted to bring a piece of the opera house into their homes, and the influence spread beyond music. Fashion was shaped by what singers wore on stage, hairstyles copied from the prima donnas, jewelry and fans and the cut of a gown, opera as tastemaker, as arbiter of style. The singers photographed, though this is still before photography, painted rather, their portraits sold as engravings, images that could be pinned up or framed, early celebrity culture forming around these voices, these personalities who commanded stages and imaginations alike. In the midst of all this spectacle and commerce, there were reformers who worried that opera had lost its way, that the music had become too ornate, the plots too absurd, the focus on vocal display overwhelming the drama, and voices began calling for change, for a return to first principles, to the idea that opera should move the audience through integrated drama, not through a succession of brilliant but disconnected arias. Christoph Willibald Gluck became the leading figure of this reform movement, composing operas that simplified the vocal lines, that reduced the opportunities for improvised ornamentation, that gave the orchestra a more prominent role, that tried to make every element serve the drama rather than distracting from it. His Orfeo ed Eurydice, premiered in Vienna in 1762, returned to the same myth that had launched opera, but treated it with a new directness, a new emotional honesty. The famous aria, Che farò senza Euridice. What shall I do without Eurydice is beautiful but restrained, expressing grief through simplicity rather than elaborate display, trusting the melody and the words to carry the weight of loss. Gluck's reforms influenced the next generation, but they did not replace the old style so much as exist alongside it, because opera was large enough to contain multitudes, serious and comic, reformed and traditional, Italian and French and German. each with its own conventions and appeal, each finding its audience. And then came Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a composer who had been writing operas since childhood, who understood the form from the inside, who could work within any convention and make it seem new, who could write opera seria that transcended its formality, opera buffa that went deeper than comedy, works that combined everything opera could be into something greater than the sum of its parts. His collaboration with the librettist Lorenzo da Ponte produced 3 masterpieces in the space of 4 years: Le Nozze di Figaro in 1786, Don Giovanni in 1787, Così fan tutti in 1790, each one perfect in its way, each one revealing different facets of human nature through music that seems to flow from some inexhaustible spring of melody and insight. Figaro takes the characters of opera buffa, the clever servant, the amorous count, the countess caught between dignity and heartbreak, and gives them music of such psychological depth that they become fully human, complex, contradictory. The Countess's aria, Porgy, Amor, is one of the most beautiful expressions of sadness in all of opera. A woman asking love itself for either relief or death. Her dignity maintained even in desperation, and the ensembles. Mozart's gift for ensemble writing was unparalleled. The finale of Act 2 of Figaro builds and builds, characters entering one by one, each adding their voice to the confusion, the music growing more complex as the dramatic situation becomes more tangled, until 7 people are singing at once, each with their own melody, their own perspective, and yet it all fits together, makes musical sense even as it portrays complete chaos. Don Giovanni is darker, a comedy that ends with the protagonist dragged down to hell by the statue of a man he murdered. Mozart and da Ponte called it a dramma giocoso, a playful drama, and it is both. Giovanni is a seducer and a murderer, charming and monstrous, and the music captures both aspects. His champagne aria is exuberant and infectious, impossible not to be caught up in his energy, while the music of the final scene, when the Commendatore's statue comes to dinner, is genuinely terrifying, the underworld reaching up to claim what it is owed. These operas were successful, but not overwhelmingly so. Figaro had to compete with other operas, other entertainments. It was appreciated but not immediately recognized as the towering achievement it was. Don Giovanni confused some audiences. Was it comedy or tragedy? Why did it mix the two so thoroughly? And Così fan tutti, with its cynical plot about testing fidelity, struck some as immoral, as treating love too lightly. But Mozart continued writing. His final opera, Die Zauberflöte, The Magic Flute, premiered in Vienna in 1791, just months before his death, and it was different from everything that had come before, written in German rather than Italian, intended for a popular theater rather than the court opera, filled with spectacle and magic and symbolism that has been debated ever since. It is a fairy tale and a Masonic allegory, a comedy and a quest narrative, with music that ranges from the coloratura brilliance of the Queen of the Night's Vengeance aria, all fury and technical display, high notes that seem impossible, that challenge even the greatest sopranos, to the solemn chorales of the priests, to the folk-like simplicity of Papageno's songs, the birdcatcher who wants nothing more than a simple life and a partner to share it with. The Magic Flute was popular immediately. Audiences loved its variety, Its combination of high and low, serious and comic, and it continued to be performed after Mozart's death, one of the few of his operas to maintain a continuous presence in the repertoire, proof that opera could speak to popular audiences and contain profound meanings simultaneously. The French Revolution disrupted opera as it disrupted everything. Theaters closed or repurposed. The old aristocratic patronage system collapsed, but opera survived, adapted, found new subjects and revolutionary themes in tales of liberation and heroism, in spectacles that celebrated the triumph of the people over tyranny. And as Europe reorganized itself after the Revolution and Napoleon's wars, opera entered a new phase. The 19th century would see it transform again, become grander, more emotional, more concerned with individual psychology and national identity. But that transformation was built on everything that had come before, on centuries of experimentation and refinement. In Italy, Rossini emerged as the dominant figure of the early 1800s, writing operas at an astonishing pace, sometimes several in a single year. Works like Il Barbiere di Siviglia, The Barber of Seville, which took a character from the Figaro story, the barber who helps the Count win Rosina, and made him the center of a comedy that sparkles with wit and energy, music that bubbles and fizzes, that captures the joy of youthful schemes and successful tricks. Rossini's writing for voice was fiendishly difficult, requiring agility and precision, rapid scales and ornamentation, the famous Rossini crescendo, where the orchestra builds and builds in volume and intensity, creating excitement that feels almost physical, and his comic timing was impeccable, knowing exactly when to pause, when to rush forward, when to let a joke land through music alone. But he also wrote serious operas, works on historical subjects. Guillaume Tell, his final opera, premiered in 1829, told the story of Swiss independence, included an overture that became one of the most famous pieces of orchestral music. And then Rossini stopped, retired from opera composition at the age of 37, spent the remaining decades of his life in comfortable retirement, hosting dinner parties, composing occasional pieces, but never another opera. The reasons for his retirement have been debated. Perhaps he had said what he wanted to say. Perhaps the new romantic style that was emerging did not suit his temperament. Perhaps he simply grew tired of the pressure and the deadlines. Whatever the reason, Italian opera lost its greatest composer at the height of his powers, and the field was open for others. Bellini and Donizetti continued the bel canto tradition, beautiful singing with operas that showcased the voice in long, flowing melodies that required singers with perfect technique and emotional expressiveness. Bellini's Norma, with its famous aria Casta Diva, is one of the supreme tests of the soprano voice, a prayer to the moon that must be sung with absolute purity and control. Any flaw exposed in those long, sustained phrases. Donizetti was more prolific, writing comedies and tragedies with equal facility. L'Élixir d'amour, The Elixir of Love, is a comic opera of great charm, but Lucia di Lammermoor is pure tragedy, the story of a woman driven mad by forced marriage and lost love. Her mad scene, one of the most famous in all opera, the soprano accompanied by a flute, her voice and the instrument in dialogue, portraying a mind that has broken, that has retreated into a world where past and present blur together. In France, grand opera was developing its own characteristics, works on an enormous scale, with large choruses and ballet, with spectacular scenic effects. Giacomo Meyerbeer became the master of this style, writing operas like Les Huguenots, set during the religious wars of the 16th century, filled with pageantry and violence, music that served spectacle while maintaining dramatic coherence. The Paris Opera was the most prestigious opera house in Europe. To succeed there was to succeed everywhere, and composers tailored their works to French taste, to the requirement for ballet, for grand choruses, for effects that would impress the sophisticated Parisian audience. Opera as demonstration of what could be achieved when resources were unlimited, when the best singers and the finest orchestra and the most skilled craftsmen all worked together. And in Germany, Wagner was beginning his career, though we are still in the early 1800s, still before he would revolutionize opera, transform it into music drama. But already he was composing, learning his craft, studying the operas of his predecessors, absorbing everything from Italian bel canto to French grand opera to German romantic opera, preparing to synthesize it all into something new. The opera house had become a central institution of European cultural life. Cities competed to build grander theaters, to attract better singers, to present more spectacular productions. Opera was civic pride made audible, a way for a city to demonstrate its sophistication and wealth, and the repertoire was expanding, older works beginning to be revived alongside new compositions. The idea that some operas might be permanent additions to the repertoire rather than temporary entertainments. Mozart's operas were rediscovered in the early 1800s. After decades of neglect, Don Giovanni in particular was championed by the Romantics, who saw in it a masterpiece of dramatic music, a work that balanced classical form with romantic content, that portrayed the dark side of human nature with unflinching honesty, and it entered the repertoire permanently, became a work that every major opera house wanted to produce, that singers aspired to perform. Technology was changing too. Gas lighting replaced candles, allowing for more controlled effects, for dimming and brightening, for creating atmosphere in new ways, and the orchestra grew larger, more instruments added to create the bigger sounds that the Romantic era demanded, that could fill the increasingly large theaters being built to accommodate opera's growing popularity. The voice itself was changing, or rather, the ideal vocal sound was evolving, the lighter, more agile singing of the 18th century giving way to voices with more weight, more power, capable of soaring over larger orchestras, of filling bigger spaces. The castrati were disappearing, their voices replaced by tenors and sopranos, who developed different techniques, different qualities, though perhaps not the same superhuman facility that the castrati had possessed, and repertoire was becoming international. Italian operas performed in Vienna and Paris, French operas translated and performed in London, German operas making their way south, singers traveling from city to city, from engagement to engagement, building international careers, becoming known across the continent, opera as the first truly international art form, transcending language barriers through the power of music, creating a shared culture that linked the capitals of Europe. The question that lingered in all of this, the question that philosophers and critics debated in their journals and treatises, was what opera actually was, whether it was a mongrel art form that diluted both music and drama, or whether it was something greater than either, a synthesis that could express truths inaccessible to words or music alone. Some argued that opera was inherently absurd, that people do not sing their conversations, that the moment a character breaks into aria, realism shatters. And yet, the defenders of opera pointed out that realism was never the goal, that opera dealt in emotional truth rather than literal truth, that a great aria could convey the interior landscape of a character's mind in a way that spoken dialogue never could. When Beethoven composed his single opera, Fidelio, he struggled with it for years, revised it multiple times because he understood that opera required a different kind of thinking than symphonic music, required balancing dramatic pacing with musical structure, serving the text while maintaining musical coherence. And the result, though it took him years to achieve, was an opera about freedom and fidelity, about the triumph of love over tyranny, music that could make an audience believe in the possibility of heroism, of moral courage, of liberation. The great singers understood something that cannot quite be put into words, that opera exists in the moment of performance, that no two performances are ever identical, that the magic happens in the space between the written note and the sung phrase, in the choices made in real time, in response to the acoustic of the hall, the energy of the audience, the collaboration with the conductor and the other singers. Maria Malibran, one of the great sopranos of the early 1800s, was known for her dramatic intensity, for performances so emotionally charged that audiences were left shaken, and she died young, not yet 30, from injuries sustained in a riding accident. But her legend persisted, stories of her performances told and retold, the way she could make you believe utterly in the character she portrayed, could make the improbable plots of opera feel like the most important truths in the world. And this is part of opera's enduring fascination, this combination of the ephemeral and the eternal, the music written down and preserved, but each performance unique, lost the moment it ends, except in memory. In the stories people tell about the night they heard a particular singer in a particular role, the night when everything aligned, when the magic was palpable, when opera fulfilled its promise of transcendence, the aria became a form unto itself, extracted from operas and performed in concerts, published for amateur singers, becoming part of the cultural vocabulary. People who had never seen an opera might know certain arias, might be able to hum them or recognize them, the music escaping its original context, taking on a life of its own, becoming emblematic of emotion itself, the queen of the night's rage, the countess's sorrow, Figaro's wit, all distilled into musical phrases that could stand alone. Opera houses became monuments, architectural statements about a city's values and aspirations. The Teatro alla Scala in Milan, the Vienna State Opera, the Palais Garnier in Paris with its grand staircase and Chagall ceiling, each one a palace dedicated to this art form, with acoustics carefully designed, sight lines calculated, every technical element in service of the central goal, creating the conditions for opera to work its peculiar magic. And the tradition of the opera season developed, autumn through spring, a social calendar built around premieres and revivals, opening night as an event where the audience was as much on display as the performers, where fashion and politics and artistic debate all mingled, where reputations could be made or destroyed, where a new work might be booed off the stage or acclaimed as a masterpiece, the audience wielding real power, their approval necessary for success. The composers who followed, Verdi and Wagner and Puccini, Strauss and Berg and Britten, would transform opera again and again, would push it in directions the early pioneers could never have imagined, would use chromatic harmony and leitmotifs, would abandon traditional aria structure, would set operas in contemporary times or in symbolic dreamscapes, would make the orchestra an equal partner in the drama rather than mere accompaniment. But all of it, all the revolution and evolution that followed, was built on those first experiments in Florence, on Monteverdi's insight that music could embody drama, on the singers who devoted their lives to mastering an impossible art, on the composers who wrote prolifically, and the audiences who filled theaters night after night, on centuries of accumulated wisdom about what works on stage, what moves an audience, what makes a moment memorable. Opera absorbed everything: folk songs and church music, dance rhythms and military marches, the sounds of the street and the sounds of the spheres. It could be vulgar and sublime, trivial and profound. It could make you laugh and weep within the same act, the same scene even. It contained multitudes because it was created by multitudes, by composers and librettists and singers and instrumentalists, by set designers and costume makers, by the technicians who worked the ropes and the prompters who whispered the words, by the audiences who came expecting to be transported, who gave their attention and their emotion, who made opera a living conversation between stage and house. The night deepens around these thoughts, around the accumulated weight of 4 centuries of music and drama intertwined, and I find myself thinking about silence, about the spaces between the notes, about the held breath before a high note, the pause before the final cadence. Opera taught Europe how to listen, how to sit in darkness and give hours of attention to an unfolding story, how to surrender to emotion without embarrassment, how to accept that a man might sing his dying words, or a woman might express her love in cascades of coloratura, and that this heightened reality might reveal something true, something essential about the human experience. The singers who devoted years to training, learning languages they might never speak conversationally, studying music theory and dramatic technique, building the physical stamina to perform roles that could last hours, developing the breath control to sustain impossible phrases. They were athletes and artists both, their instrument, their own body, which meant that age and illness and simple tiredness were always factors, that a career could end with a vocal injury, that the great roles had to be approached at the right moment in a singer's development, too early, and the voice might not be ready, too late, and the high notes might be gone. There is something moving about the impermanence of it, about knowing that all the great performances of the past exist only in memory and description, that we cannot hear Farinelli or Malibran or any of the legendary singers of the 18th and 19th centuries, that even the early recordings from the 20th century capture only a ghost of what it must have been like to sit in a theater, to feel the sound in your chest, to be part of the collective experience of an audience moved as one. Opera persists because it offers something that cannot be found elsewhere. This combination of music and theater, of spectacle and intimacy, of the human voice pushed to its limits in service of stories about love and death, power and sacrifice, revenge and forgiveness, the themes that have always moved us, that will always move up, dressed in the costumes of gods and heroes, kings and peasants, but always fundamentally about us, about what it means to be human, to want, to lose, to hope despite everything. The curtain falls, the house lights rise, the audience emerges blinking into the night, carrying something of the performance with them, humming a melody, replaying a moment, the plot already fading, but the emotion lingering. This is opera's gift, this transformation of time and sound into memory, into feeling that outlasts the event itself. And somewhere tonight, in opera houses across the world, the ritual continues, orchestras tuning, singers warming up, audiences finding their seats, the lights dimming, the conductor raising the baton, the first notes rising into the air. The same magic attempted again, never quite the same as last night or the night before, but always reaching for that moment of connection, of transcendence, of being lifted out of ordinary time into something more vivid, more intense, more fully alive. The stories that opera tells are often impossible, filled with coincidence and misunderstanding, gods who meddle and lovers who die. And yet, in the moment of performance, in the combination of music and voice and drama, they feel true, feel necessary, feel like the only way to express what needs expressing. I think of the composers bent over manuscript paper by candlelight, writing through the night to meet a deadline, trusting that the singers will bring the notes to life, that the orchestra will find the right tempos, that the audience will understand what is being offered. This leap of faith that creation requires, this belief that beauty matters, that art matters, that the human voice raised in song can still, after all these centuries, make us feel something we have never quite felt before. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is everything. This continuous renewal of the form, this passing of tradition from generation to generation, this insistence that opera remains relevant, remains necessary, remains capable of moving us in ways that nothing else quite can. The echo fades, the memory softens, and what remains is simply this, the knowledge that somewhere in the world, voices are rising, orchestras are playing, and opera continues, as it has for more than 400 years, as it will for as long as there are voices to sing, and ears to hear, and hearts to be moved by the impossible beauty of it all. The lamplight falls softly across the old wooden desk, and outside the window the night has settled into that particular kind of stillness that belongs to the hours when most of the world has turned inward, when the hum of the day has faded, and what remains is the quiet company of thought and the gentle pull of curiosity. Tonight there is a story to consider, a story that unfolds not in a single place or a single moment, but across centuries and continents, woven through laboratories and apothecaries, through ancient gardens and modern glass towers, through the careful hands of healers and the restless minds of scientists, all of them seeking the same thing, understanding how the substances we take into our bodies can shift the currents of health and illness, comfort and suffering. This is the world of pharmacology, a word that itself seems to carry a kind of weight, a seriousness, but also a beauty when you let it settle on the tongue. From the Greek pharmakon, meaning drug, or remedy, or even poison, because the ancients understood something we sometimes forget, that the difference between medicine and harm often lives in the smallest of measures, in the delicate calibration of dose and timing and need. And there is something almost meditative about tracing this story backward, peeling away the layers of discovery, finding the threads that connect a modern prescription bottle to a clay tablet pressed with cuneiform, or a chemist's flask to a monk's garden, each connection revealing how human beings have always sought to intervene in the processes of the body, to ease pain, to fight disease, to restore what has been lost. The story begins, as so many stories do, not with a beginning at all, but with a moment suspended in the middle of a much longer arc. Imagine a room, perhaps in Basel, or perhaps in London, or perhaps somewhere you have never been, where light filters through tall windows and falls across shelves lined with glass bottles, each one labeled in careful script. And inside these bottles, powders and tinctures, extracts and compounds, each one the result of countless hours of grinding and mixing, heating and cooling, observing and recording. But before there were these rooms, these laboratories, with their careful measurements and scientific instruments, there were other spaces, older spaces, where knowledge moved differently, passed from teacher to student through demonstration and memory, through stories told beside grinding stones, through the careful cultivation of plants whose properties had been learned through generations of trial and error and sometimes tragedy. The soil holds its secrets well, and the first pharmacologists were those who learned to read the language of roots and leaves, who understood that the bark of one tree might bring down a fever, while the flower of another might ease the racing of an anxious heart, or bring on visions, or stop a heart entirely. And this knowledge was precious, sometimes sacred, always powerful. There is something peaceful about imagining those early gardens, where monks in medieval Europe grew foxglove and mandrake, where Chinese herbalists tended ginseng and ephedra, where Amazonian healers knew the secrets of ayahuasca and curare, each culture developing its own materia medica, its own catalog of remedies, its own understanding of how the natural world could be harnessed to serve human need, and slowly, over centuries, this knowledge began to change shape as alchemy gave way to chemistry, as observation became experimentation, as the question shifted from what does this plant do to why does it do it, and can we isolate the part that works, and can we make it ourselves? The transformation was not sudden. Nothing in science ever is, but rather a gradual brightening, like dawn spreading across a landscape, revealing details that had always been there, but had existed in shadow. And with this brightening came new tools, the microscope, the balance, the distillation apparatus, each one extending human perception into realms that had been invisible before. Tonight, in this quiet hour, we follow that transformation, tracing the path from root to molecule, from garden to laboratory, from empirical knowledge passed down through generations to systematic understanding built up through careful experiment. And in doing so, we find ourselves in the company of those who devoted their lives to this pursuit, who spent years grinding cinchona bark or purifying morphine, who tested compounds on themselves because there was no other way to know, who failed more often than they succeeded, but who gradually, patiently, built the foundation of modern pharmacology. The night deepens outside the window, and the story begins to unfold in earnest, ready to carry us through the long arc of discovery that connects ancient wisdom to contemporary medicine, each chapter revealing another layer, another connection, another moment when human understanding took a step forward into the unknown. The story reaches back further than most people imagine, back beyond the gleaming laboratories and precisely calibrated instruments, back to a time when the boundary between food and medicine was barely a line at all, when survival itself depended on knowing which plants could nourish and which could kill, and which could do something stranger still, could alter pain or consciousness or the course of disease. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia, more than 4,000 years ago, scribes pressed wedges into soft clay tablets, recording recipes that mixed the practical with the mystical, instructions for preparing remedies from thyme and mustard, from poppy and mandrake. The Sumerians knew opium, called it hulgil, the plant of joy, and they understood something about its power to transform suffering, even if they could not have explained the chemistry of alkaloids binding to receptors in the brain. The knowledge spread outward, carried along trade routes, adapted and transformed by each culture that encountered it. In Egypt, the Ebers. Papyrus stretched more than 20 meters long, a scroll dating to around 1500 before the Common Era, filled with more than 700 remedies, prescriptions for everything from crocodile bites to baldness, some of them surprisingly effective, others hopelessly entangled with the magic and ritual, but all of them representing an attempt to systematize healing knowledge, to create a pharmacopoeia that could be consulted and taught. And in these ancient texts, you can see the first stirrings of pharmacological thinking, not just this plant helps with that ailment, but attempts to categorize, to understand properties and actions. The Egyptians recognized that some substances cooled while others heated, some dried while others moistened, a framework that seems quaint now, but which represented a genuine effort to find patterns, to build theory from observation. Across the Mediterranean, in the Greek world, this impulse toward systematization found new expression. Hippocrates, whose name would become synonymous with medicine itself, compiled knowledge about hundreds of medicinal plants, but more importantly, he began to ask different questions, not just what works, but how might we understand why it works? What principles might govern the action of remedies on the body? His successor in this endeavor, Dioscorides, was a physician who traveled with Roman armies in the 1st century of the Common Era, and everywhere he went, he collected specimens, interviewed local healers, recorded preparations. His great work, De Materia Medica, described about 600 plants and nearly 1,000 drugs, and it would remain the definitive pharmacological text in Europe for more than 1,500 years, copied and recopied by scribes, translated into Arabic and Syriac and Persian, illustrated with careful drawings of leaves and flowers and roots. What made Dioscorides different, what made his work endure, was his attention to practical detail. He didn't just list plants and their uses. He described how to identify them in the field, when to harvest them, how to prepare and store them. He understood that knowledge was worthless if it couldn't be reliably transmitted and applied, and so he built a framework that could travel across time and space, carrying healing knowledge to generations yet unborn. But the Greeks were doing something else too, something that would prove essential to the future of pharmacology. They were beginning to think about dose, about the relationship between amount and effect. Paracelsus, centuries later, would crystallize this into a principle. but the ancients already intuited the truth that the difference between remedy and poison was often simply a matter of measure. In the East, parallel streams of knowledge were flowing, developing their own sophisticated understandings of how substances affected the body. The great Chinese medical text known as the Shenong Bencao Jing, attributed to the legendary divine farmer, cataloged 365 medicines, categorizing them into superior, medium, and inferior grades, based not on efficacy alone, but on a complex understanding of how they interacted with the body's vital forces, its qi and blood, its heating and cooling energies. The Indian Ayurvedic tradition, equally ancient, developed the concept of rasa shastra, the science of mercury and mineral preparations, alongside elaborate classifications of plant medicines. These weren't primitive systems. They were sophisticated frameworks built on centuries of observation, transmission, and refinement, and many of the plants they identified as medicinal have since been validated by modern pharmacology, their traditional uses confirmed by the isolation of active compounds. As the Roman Empire fell and Europe fragmented into smaller kingdoms, much of this knowledge might have been lost, scattered, and forgotten, but it found sanctuary in an unexpected place, in the monasteries, where monks preserved not only religious texts, but also the medical wisdom of the ancients. They created physic gardens, growing medicinal herbs within their walls, and they continued the work of copying manuscripts, including the precious medical texts that contained pharmacological knowledge. These monastic gardens were often laid out with careful attention to symbolism and order, each bed containing plants grouped by property or use. And here, in these quiet, enclosed spaces, generation after generation of monks cultivated their understanding of healing plants, learned to recognize them by leaf and flower, to harvest them at the proper time, to prepare them into tinctures and poultices and decoctions. But the monks were not working in isolation, because by the 8th and 9th centuries, another culture had become the guardian and extender of medical knowledge. The Islamic Golden Age saw an extraordinary flourishing of scientific inquiry, and pharmacy emerged as a distinct discipline, separate from medicine for the first time in history. In Baghdad, in Cairo, in Cordoba, and Damascus, physicians and pharmacists built on the Greek foundation, but they didn't simply preserve. They innovated. They developed new preparations, syrups and rose water and alcohol distillates. They introduced materia medica from India and China, camphor and senna, musk and tamarind, expanding the pharmacopoeia beyond what the ancients had known. Al-Razi, known in the West as Rahazis, who worked in Baghdad in the 9th and 10th centuries, wrote extensively about drug preparation and the importance of using the simplest effective remedy. He tested medicines systematically, documented their effects, distinguished between different preparations of the same substance. He understood that pharmacology required precision, required careful record-keeping, required a scientific mindset. And then there was Ibn Sina, Avicenna, whose canon of medicine became the most influential medical text in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. He didn't just list drugs and their uses. He developed theories about how medicines worked, about their primary and secondary qualities, about how they should be combined and prepared. His work represented a genuine attempt at pharmaceutical theory at understanding the principles that govern drug action, the Islamic pharmacists also did something revolutionary. They established the first private pharmacies, separate from physicians' practices, and they created standards, guidelines for drug preparation and storage, quality control measures. They understood that medicine required not just knowledge, but infrastructure systems to ensure that remedies were prepared consistently and safely. This knowledge flowed back into Europe through multiple channels, through the medical school at Salerno in Italy, where Arabic texts were translated into Latin, through the courts of Sicily and Spain, where Islamic and Christian scholars worked side by side, and gradually, European medicine began to absorb this richer, more sophisticated understanding of drugs and their preparation. By the 13th and 14th centuries, apothecaries were emerging as a distinct profession in European cities. Their shops became recognizable features of urban life, with their distinctive mortars and pestles, their rows of jars and bottles, their scales for weighing ingredients. These weren't just stores, they were repositories of knowledge, places where the art of drug preparation was practiced and refined. The apothecaries developed their own guild structures, their own systems of apprenticeship. A young person might spend 7 years learning the trade, memorizing hundreds of plant names and their properties, learning to compound medicines according to traditional formulas, mastering the delicate arts of extraction and preservation. It was craft knowledge passed down through demonstration and practice, knowledge that lived in the hands as much as in books. And slowly, very slowly, this craft was beginning to encounter something new, the stirrings of what would become experimental science, the idea that you could test, could compare, could measure and quantify, the idea that tradition, while valuable, wasn't sacred, that old knowledge could be questioned and improved upon. The 16th century brought Paracelsus, a figure so controversial that arguments about his legacy continue today. A physician who rejected much of the Galenic tradition that had dominated medicine for more than 1,000 years, who insisted that chemistry, not just herbalism, was the key to understanding drugs, who declared that all things are poison and nothing is without poison. Only the dose permits something not to be poisonous, a principle that would become foundational to pharmacology. Paracelsus was abrasive, confrontational. He burned Avicenna's canon in public, scandalized his colleagues, and yet, beneath the bombast, he was pointing toward something important, toward the idea that medicines didn't work through mystical qualities, but through their chemical nature. That understanding, this nature required investigation, experimentation, measurement. He introduced mineral medicines, preparations of mercury and antimony and sulfur, some of them genuinely useful, others dangerous. He believed that the body contained an inner alchemist that transformed substance. And while his theoretical framework was wrong, his emphasis on chemistry as the foundation of drug action pointed in a direction that would eventually prove fruitful. The 17th century saw these various threads beginning to weave together: the herbalist tradition, the chemical approach, the emerging experimental method, and slowly, without anyone quite realizing it was happening, pharmacy was beginning its transformation into pharmacology, from an art based on tradition and authority to a science based on investigation and evidence. The change would take centuries to complete, but the first steps were being taken, tentative, uncertain, but pointing forward into a future where understanding would replace mystery, where mechanism would illuminate effect. The transformation began in earnest with a substance that had been known for millennia, but never truly understood. Opium, the dried latex of the poppy, had been used since ancient times, but in the early 19th century, a young German pharmacist's apprentice named Friedrich Serturner decided to investigate what made it work, what gave it its power to ease pain and induce stupor. Working alone in his apothecary, with equipment he built himself, Serturner extracted a crystalline substance from opium, something pure and potent. He tested it on stray dogs, then on himself and 3 young friends, to a reckless experiment that nearly killed them all, but which proved beyond doubt that he had isolated the active principle, the molecule responsible for opium's effects. He called it morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. This was the breakthrough that changed everything, because if you could isolate the active ingredient, you could standardize the dose. You could understand the structure. You could begin to ask why it worked the way it did. Morphine became the first alkaloid ever purified from a plant, the first time a pure chemical compound had been identified as the source of a drug's action, and suddenly a new kind of investigation became possible. Others followed Serturner's path. Chemists began extracting and purifying active compounds from traditional medicines, strychnine from Nux vomica, quinine from cinchona bark, atropine from deadly nightshade. Each isolation was a revelation, showing that plants didn't work through vague qualities or mystical essences, but through specific molecules with specific structures, molecules that could be weighed and measured, studied and modified. The extraction of quinine was particularly significant because malaria was one of the great killers of the age, and cinchona bark, brought from South America, was the only effective treatment, but the bark was variable in potency, difficult to dose, sometimes ineffective. When Pierre-Joseph Pelletier and Joseph Bien-Aimé Caventou isolated pure quinine in 1820, they gave physicians a tool of unprecedented reliability, a white crystalline powder that could be measured precisely, that worked predictably, that saved countless lives. And slowly, through the middle decades of the 19th century, the work continued, each new isolation expanding the catalog of pure drugs, each one representing hours of painstaking work, grinding and dissolving, heating and filtering, crystallizing and recrystallizing, until what remained was a substance of such purity that its properties could be studied with scientific precision. But isolation was only the beginning, because once you had a pure compound, you could begin to ask deeper questions. What was its chemical structure? How did it interact with the body? Could you modify it to make it more effective or less toxic? And answering these questions required new tools, new techniques, new ways of thinking about the relationship between molecular structure and biological effect. The development of organic chemistry in the mid-1800s provided those tools. Chemists learned to determine molecular formulas, to understand how atoms bonded together, to recognize functional groups that conferred particular properties, and gradually they began to see patterns, that certain structural features tended to produce certain physiological effects, that small changes in molecular architecture could dramatically alter a drug's action, This understanding led to the birth of medicinal chemistry, the deliberate modification of natural compounds to enhance their therapeutic properties. One of the first triumphs came with the synthesis of aspirin, the biochemist Felix Hoffmann, seeking a better treatment for his father's arthritis, modified salicylic acid, a compound derived from willow bark, by adding an acetyl group. The result was acetyl salicylic acid, less irritating to the stomach, more tolerable, more effective. A drug that would become one of the most widely used medicines in history. But Hoffmann's work on aspirin was almost an afterthought, because what Bayer really wanted was a better cough suppressant, and just days after synthesizing aspirin, Hoffmann modified morphine, creating diacetylmorphine, a compound the company would market as heroin, believing it to be a safer, non-addictive alternative to morphine, a catastrophic misjudgment that would haunt medicine for generations, and which illustrated the double-edged nature of pharmaceutical innovation, that the power to heal and the power to harm often resided in the same molecule, separated only by dose or circumstance or understanding. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, pharmacology was establishing itself as a scientific discipline, distinct from both pharmacy and medicine. The German physiologist Oswald Schmiedeberg, working in Strasbourg, created the first true pharmacology department, training a generation of researchers who would spread across Europe and America, establishing programs, building laboratories, defining the methods and questions that would shape the field. These early pharmacologists asked fundamental questions about how drugs worked, how they were absorbed and distributed through the body, how they were metabolized and excreted, how their effects varied with dose and route of administration. They developed techniques to measure drug concentrations in blood and tissues, to track their movement through the body, to correlate dose with effect in quantitative ways. One of the most important insights came from understanding receptors. The idea that drugs didn't work by some general action on tissues, but by binding to specific molecular targets, sites that recognized certain chemical structures. Paul Ehrlich, working in the early 1900s, proposed the concept of chemotherapy, the idea that you could find or design molecules that would target disease-causing organisms while sparing healthy tissue. He called it the magic bullet approach, and spent years testing compound after compound, seeking molecules that would kill trypanosomes or spirochetes without poisoning the patient. His work was tedious, methodical. Compound number 606 proved effective against syphilis, but only after testing 605 failures. This was the new reality of drug discovery, not serendipitous findings in nature, but systematic chemical synthesis and biological testing, screening hundreds or thousands of compounds to find one that worked, a process that required patience, resources, and an almost industrial approach to research. The early 20th century also saw growing awareness that drugs needed regulation, that the marketplace couldn't be trusted to ensure safety or efficacy. Too many patent medicines contained dangerous substances, made fraudulent claims, harmed the people who took them in America. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 began to impose standards, but it would take tragedies to drive real reform. The sulfanilamide disaster of 1937, when more than 100 people died from a preparation that used diethylene glycol as a solvent, led to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which required safety testing before drugs could be marketed, and the thalidomide tragedy of the early 1960s, when a drug marketed as a safe sedative for pregnant women caused severe birth defects in thousands of children, led to requirements for proof of efficacy, not just safety. These regulations transformed drug development, making it longer, more expensive, more rigorous, but also more reliable. Companies now had to conduct systematic studies, gather data, prove their claims. Pharmacology became inseparable from clinical trials and statistical analysis, from toxicology and drug metabolism studies, from understanding not just whether a drug worked, but how it worked, how the body handled it, what happened when it was given to different populations under different conditions. Meanwhile, the science itself was advancing on multiple fronts. The discovery of neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that carried signals between nerve cells, opened up entirely new ways of thinking about drug action. If acetylcholine or norepinephrine or serotonin mediated specific functions, then drugs that mimicked or blocked these molecules could produce highly targeted effects. This understanding led to the development of beta blockers for heart disease. SSR is for depression, dopamine antagonists for schizophrenia, each class of drugs emerging from a deepening understanding of how the nervous system functioned at the molecular level. The post-war period saw an explosion of pharmaceutical innovation. Antibiotics, discovered somewhat serendipitously by Alexander Fleming, but developed into practical medicines through the systematic work of Florey and Chain and the industrial might of wartime production, revolutionized the treatment of bacterial infections. Diseases that had killed millions could now be cured with a few pills or injections. It seemed like a golden age, when every year brought new drugs, new cures, new possibilities. But the process of discovery was becoming more sophisticated, more deliberately engineered. Chemists were learning to design molecules with specific properties to predict how structural modifications would affect activity, to optimize compounds for better absorption, longer duration, fewer side effects, the advent of high-throughput screening using automated systems to test thousands of compounds against biological targets, accelerated the pace of discovery even further. And beneath all this practical work, theoretical understanding was deepening. Pharmacokinetics, the study of what the body does to a drug, became a quantitative science with mathematical models describing absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion, pharmacodynamics. The study of what a drug does to the body developed increasingly sophisticated models of dose-response relationships, of receptor-binding kinetics, of signal transduction pathways. The molecular biology revolution of the late 20th century opened yet another dimension. Suddenly researchers could clone genes, express proteins, determine three-dimensional structures of drug targets. This wasn't just helpful, it was transformative. Because if you could see the exact shape of a receptor or enzyme, you could design molecules to fit it, like crafting a key for a specific lock. Computational chemistry and molecular modeling became essential tools, allowing researchers to test millions of theoretical compounds in silico before ever synthesizing one in the laboratory. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, promised to accelerate this process even further, revealing thousands of potential drug targets, genes that when mutated caused disease, proteins that when blocked or activated might restore health. Pharmacogenomics emerged, the study of how genetic variation affects drug response, recognizing that the same drug might work differently in different people depending on their genetic makeup. That personalized medicine tailored to individual biology might be possible through all these changes from the isolation of morphine to the design of monoclonal antibodies, from herbal decoctions to gene therapies. The fundamental questions remain the same. How do we find substances that can modify disease? How do we make them safe and effective? How do we understand their actions well enough to predict their effects, to minimize their harms, to use them wisely? And the answers kept evolving, growing more sophisticated, more nuanced, revealing layer after layer of complexity in the relationship between chemistry and biology, between molecule and organism, between dose and response. The late 20th century brought both triumph and reckoning as pharmacology matured into a discipline of extraordinary sophistication, capable of designing molecules atom by atom, yet facing challenges that no amount of technical prowess could fully resolve. The laboratory bench gave way to the clinical trial, and the clinical trial revealed complexities that pure chemistry could never capture. The messiness of human biology, the variability of response, the unexpected consequences that emerged when theory met reality. The development of HIV antiretrovirals stands as perhaps the defining pharmaceutical achievement of the era. When AIDS emerged in the early 1980s, it seemed like a death sentence, inexorable, terrifying. Within a few years, researchers had identified the virus, understood its life cycle, pinpointed the enzymes it needed to replicate, and then, with remarkable speed, they designed molecules to inhibit those enzymes, AZT protease inhibitors, reverse transcriptase inhibitors, each one targeting a specific step in the viral life cycle. But the real breakthrough came from combination therapy, using multiple drugs simultaneously, attacking the virus at different points, preventing it from developing resistance. What had been a fatal diagnosis became a manageable chronic condition. People who would have died lived. The transformation was so complete, so dramatic, that it vindicated the entire enterprise of rational drug design, showed what was possible when deep biological understanding met sophisticated chemistry. Yet even this success revealed limitations. The drugs were expensive, beyond the reach of millions who needed them. They required strict adherence to complex regimens. They produced side effects that could be severe. And they didn't cure the disease, only suppressed it, requiring lifelong treatment, raising questions about access, about sustainability, about whether pharmaceutical innovation alone could solve global health challenges. These questions grew more pressing as the pharmaceutical industry itself transformed. The small family-owned firms and university spin-offs that had dominated the early 20th century gave way to massive multinational corporations, companies with revenues larger than many nations, with research budgets in the billions, with marketing arms that sometimes seemed to dwarf their scientific operations. The economics of drug development had become staggering. Bringing a new compound from laboratory to market could take 15 years and cost more than $1 billion, and the vast majority of candidates failed, never made it to approval, represented investments that would never be recouped. This economic reality shaped which diseases were studied and which were ignored. Companies focused on conditions that affected wealthy populations. Chronic diseases requiring long-term treatment, cancer and heart disease and diabetes, while neglected tropical diseases, affecting hundreds of millions of the world's poorest people, received minimal attention. The free market, left to itself, didn't allocate research toward the greatest medical need, but toward the greatest profit potential, a tension that would define pharmaceutical policy debates for decades. The rise of biologics, drugs derived from living organisms rather than chemical synthesis, added another layer of complexity. Monoclonal antibodies, proteins, engineered to bind specific targets with exquisite precision, proved remarkably effective for conditions from cancer to autoimmune disease. But they were difficult and expensive to manufacture, requiring vast bioreactors, complex purification processes, careful quality control. They couldn't be taken as pills, had to be injected or infused, and cost tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, creating treatments of unprecedented effectiveness but limited accessibility. At the same time, a darker story was unfolding around opioid medications. Pharmaceutical companies had developed new formulations of old drugs, extended-release preparations of oxycodone and hydromorphone, marketed with claims of reduced addiction risk that turned out to be tragically false. Aggressive promotion, coupled with inadequate physician education and lax prescribing practices, fueled an epidemic of addiction and overdose death that devastated communities across North America. A stark reminder that pharmacology's power to heal came with an equal power to harm, and that commercial interests didn't always align with public health. The opioid crisis prompted soul-searching about the relationship between pharmaceutical companies and medicine, about the role of marketing in drug prescribing, about whether the profit motive was compatible with the careful, conservative approach that powerful drugs required. It revealed how even well-intentioned physicians could be influenced by misleading information, how patients seeking relief from legitimate pain could become trapped in addiction, how the same molecules that had been saving lives for 2 centuries could, when misused or overprescribed, destroy them. Meanwhile, the science continued advancing. Pharmacology was merging with fields that hadn't existed a generation earlier, with genomics and proteomics, with systems biology and computational modeling, with nanotechnology and tissue engineering. Researchers could now edit genes with CRISPR, could design nanoparticles to deliver drugs to specific cell types, could grow organoids in culture to test drug effects in something approaching real tissue. The tools had become almost science-fictional in their sophistication, yet fundamental challenges remained. The brain was still largely a mystery. Psychiatric medications worked, more or less for some people, but understanding why, or why they failed for others, remained elusive. Alzheimer's disease, despite decades of research and billions invested, had no effective treatment. Candidate drugs failed trial after trial, revealing how much was still unknown about neurodegeneration, about the cascade of events that led from healthy brain to dementia. Cancer treatment had advanced dramatically, but most cancers still couldn't be cured, only managed, pushed back, held at bay for a time. The COVID-19 pandemic brought both vindication and revelation. The development of effective vaccines in less than a year using novel mRNA technology, represented an almost miraculous achievement, pharmacology and immunology working together, enabled by decades of basic research, by massive investment, by regulatory flexibility, by global cooperation. It showed what was possible when the usual constraints were loosened, when urgency overrode caution, when resources flowed freely toward a single goal. But the pandemic also exposed inequities. How vaccines reached wealthy nations first while poorer countries waited. How misinformation could undermine public health efforts. How political considerations could distort scientific discourse. How the infrastructure for drug development and distribution was deeply uneven, concentrated in certain regions, inaccessible to much of the world. These weren't new problems, but the pandemic made them impossible to ignore. And as the field moved into the 21st century, certain patterns became clear. Pharmacology had grown from a craft into a science, from observation and trial into rational design and systematic investigation. It had produced drugs that prevented or cured diseases that once killed millions, that eased suffering on a scale that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. But it had also created new problems: antibiotic resistance from overuse, addiction epidemics from overprescription, environmental contamination from pharmaceutical waste, health inequities from market-driven research priorities. The relationship between pharmacology and society had become impossibly tangled. Drugs were simultaneously life-saving medicines and commodities, tools of healing and sources of profit, objects of rigorous scientific study and targets of aggressive marketing. They were regulated by governments but developed by corporations, tested in clinical trials but prescribed based on clinical judgment and patient preference and insurance coverage. They embodied both the best of human ingenuity and some of the most intractable problems of modern capitalism. Young researchers entering the field now face choices their predecessors never had to consider: whether to work in academia or industry, whether to focus on basic science or applied research, whether to study diseases affecting millions or rare conditions affecting hundreds, whether to work on drugs that might reach market or on fundamental questions that might never have practical application. And underlying all these choices, questions about what pharmacology was for, about who it served, about what obligations came with the power to intervene in human biology at the molecular level. The tools had become extraordinary. Molecular dynamics simulations that could predict how drugs would bind to targets, high-throughput screening that could test millions of compounds, artificial intelligence that could identify patterns in vast data sets, suggest new drug candidates, predict side effects. But tools alone didn't answer the fundamental questions. Which diseases should be prioritized? How should drugs be priced? Who should have access? How should risks and benefits be weighed? How much precaution was appropriate before releasing a new drug? How to balance innovation with safety, speed with thoroughness. And perhaps this was the real story of modern pharmacology. Not just the accumulation of knowledge and technique, but the growing awareness of complexity, of how much remained unknown, of how intervening in biological systems always produced unexpected consequences, of how social and economic structures shaped which questions got asked and which answers got pursued. The field had gained immense power, but with that power came responsibility, came uncertainty, came the need for humility in the face of biological complexity and social consequences that couldn't be fully predicted or controlled. The night outside has deepened further, and the story has traced its arc from ancient gardens to modern laboratories, from empirical observation to molecular design, from simple remedies to sophisticated interventions. And now, having followed this long thread through time, it becomes possible to step back, to consider not just the history, but what it means, what it reveals about the human relationship with nature and with our own biology, about the possibilities and limits of understanding, about what we gain and what we risk when we reach for the power to alter life at its most fundamental levels. The deepening quiet of this hour invites a different kind of consideration, not the chronological unfolding of events, but something more lateral, more wandering, the kind of thinking that happens when the mind is allowed to drift across connections that don't announce themselves in daylight, when patterns emerge that the focused analytical gaze might miss. Consider the strange intimacy of pharmacology, how it represents perhaps the most direct intervention one organism can make into the workings of another, a molecule shaped by chemists or extracted from plants, crossing membranes, entering cells, binding to receptors, altering the cascade of signals that constitute sensation and thought and bodily function. There is something almost invasive about it, and yet also something tender, this desire to ease suffering, to restore function, to give the body what it needs to heal itself. Every drug tells a story about boundaries, about where one thing ends and another begins. The pharmaceutical chemist designs a molecule that will slip past the body's defenses, cross the blood-brain barrier or the intestinal wall, reach its target despite all the systems evolved to keep foreign substances out. It's a kind of biochemical lockpicking, elegant and transgressive at once, finding the gaps in cellular architecture, exploiting the porosity that makes life possible, but also vulnerable. And there is poetry in the names themselves, words that accumulate like sediment, layer upon layer of meaning, morphine from Morpheus, atropine from Atropos, one of the three fates who cuts the thread of life, appropriate for a substance derived from deadly nightshade that can dilate pupils or stop a heart, depending on dose, or considered digitalis, from the Latin for finger, because the flowers of foxglove look like fingertips, a plant that strengthens the failing heart, that contains molecules so perfectly shaped to bind sodium-potassium pumps that they might have been designed for the purpose, though of course they weren't. They evolved for reasons having nothing to do with human hearts, and we simply learn to exploit them. This is one of the deeper mysteries. Why plant alkaloids and animal receptors fit together at all? Why molecules that evolved in completely separate lineages for completely different purposes should interact so specifically? Opium poppies didn't evolve morphine to ease human pain. They evolved it as a defense against herbivores, as a chemical weapon, and yet by chance or by some deeper principle of chemistry, these molecules happen to fit receptors in the human brain that normally bind endorphins, our own internal opioids, the body's natural analgesics. It suggests that there are only so many ways to build a molecule that does a particular kind of chemical work, that the space of possible structures is vast but not infinite, that nature explores the same solutions repeatedly, finding the shapes that work. the configurations that bind, the architectures that produce effect, and pharmacology is in some sense the study of this chemical space, mapping the relationships between structure and function, between shape and effect, between what a molecule is and what it does. The history of drug discovery is filled with accidents, with substances found while looking for something else. Penicillin discovered in contaminated cultures. LSD synthesized in a search for respiratory stimulants. Sildenafil developed for angina but found to have more marketable effects. These serendipitous findings suggest that we still don't fully understand the mapping between molecular structure and biological activity, that there are still surprises waiting, effects we haven't predicted, uses we haven't imagined, but there is also something unsettling in this, the recognition that every drug is a kind of promiscuous molecule, that it never binds to just one target, never produces just one effect. The desired action is always accompanied by off-target effects, by interactions we didn't intend and sometimes don't discover until after years of widespread use. The body is not a collection of isolated systems, but a web of feedback loops and cascades, and pulling on one thread always disturbs others. This is why side effects are inevitable, why every drug is a negotiation between benefit and harm, why the package insert listing adverse reactions runs for pages. The more potent the drug, the more specifically it acts, the more carefully it must be used, the narrower the window between therapeutic and toxic dose. Some drugs, like lithium for bipolar disorder or warfarin for blood clots, require regular monitoring, blood tests to ensure the level stays within the narrow range where it helps without harming. A reminder that pharmacology is always a balancing act, always walking a line between too little and too much, and beneath all the science, all the molecular models and clinical trials and regulatory frameworks, there remains something ancient, something that connects modern pharmacology to the first human who chewed willow bark for pain or brewed poppy tea for sleep. The fundamental recognition that the world contains substances that can alter our experience, that can change how we feel, how we think, how our bodies function. This knowledge is both powerful and dangerous, and every culture has had to develop ways of managing it, of deciding who can access these substances, under what circumstances, with what safeguards. The regulation of drugs is ultimately about managing this power, about trying to ensure that the benefits outweigh the harms, that those who prescribe understand what they're prescribing, that those who take drugs know what they're taking. But it's also about control, about who gets to decide what substances are medicine and what are contraband, what's therapy and what's enhancement, what's treatment and what's recreation. These boundaries are not natural. They're cultural, historical. They shift over time and differ across societies. Consider how cannabis, used medicinally for thousands of years, became illegal in much of the world in the 20th century and is now being re-legalized, reclassified as medicine again, or how amphetamines, once sold over the counter, became controlled substances, but are still prescribed to millions of children for attention deficit disorder. The same molecule can be medicine or drug of abuse, depending on context, on who's taking it and why, on whether a doctor has authorized it, on cultural attitudes and political decisions. This reveals something important about pharmacology, that it's never just about molecules, never purely scientific. It's always embedded in social structures, in economic systems, in cultural beliefs about health and disease, about normalcy and deviation, about what kinds of alteration are acceptable and what kinds are transgression. The sleeping pill is medicine, but the party drug is vice. Even when they're chemically similar, even when they work through the same mechanisms, and there is something almost philosophical about the very idea of pharmacological intervention, the assumption that we can and should modify our biology, that the states our bodies naturally fall into are not necessarily the states they should be in, that chemistry can correct, can optimize, can restore, or even enhance. It's a peculiar form of dualism, treating the body as a machine that can be adjusted, tuned, repaired with the right chemical tools. Yet we are not separate from our chemistry, consciousness itself. Emotion, memory, everything we call the mind emerges from the same molecular interactions that drugs manipulate. There is no ghost in the machine, only the machine, chemistry all the way down. And if that's true, then every thought, every feeling, every decision is already the product of molecules binding to receptors, of neurotransmitters crossing synapses, of ion channels opening and closing. Drugs don't introduce chemistry into an otherwise non-chemical system. They just alter the chemistry that was already there, shift the balances, change the concentrations, modify the ongoing molecular dance that constitutes being alive. This is both humbling and strange, to recognize that the self we experience as continuous and coherent is actually a pattern maintained by countless chemical reactions, that a few milligrams of the right substance can shift mood or perception or personality, that who we are is less fixed than we imagine, more dependent on molecular details, more contingent. It suggests that the boundary between self and substance is porous, that we are already always under the influence of hormones and neurotransmitters, of the chemicals our own bodies produce, and that pharmaceutical drugs are just another input into this ongoing process. The story comes full circle then, back to the beginning, to the recognition that humans have always known that certain substances could change experience, could ease suffering or induce visions, could heal or harm. What has changed is not this fundamental knowledge, but the sophistication of our understanding, the precision of our tools, the depth of our insight into mechanism. We have traded mystery for complexity, magic for pharmacokinetics, but the essential relationship remains between organism and substance, between biology and chemistry, between the desire to intervene and the effects of intervention. And so the lamplight still falls across the desk, and the night is still deep. But the story has traced its path from ancient gardens to molecular models, from empirical wisdom to rational design, from the first tentative observations that certain plants had certain effects, to a science capable of designing molecules atom by atom, predicting their actions, optimizing their properties, manufacturing them in vast quantities, distributing them globally, regulating their use through elaborate legal and medical frameworks. The transformation has been extraordinary, and yet, in this quiet hour, for it's worth noting what remains mysterious, how much is still unknown, how many diseases have no treatment, how many drugs work without anyone fully understanding why, how the brain remains largely opaque, how individual variation means that what works for one person fails for another, how the placebo effect reminds us that belief itself has biochemical consequences, that the mind and body are not separate systems, but aspects of a single unified process. The future of pharmacology will bring new tools, new insights, new possibilities, gene therapies and RNA drugs, personalized medicine tailored to individual genetics, artificial intelligence designing molecules no human chemist would imagine, but it will also bring new challenges, new ethical dilemmas, new questions about access and equity, about enhancement versus treatment, about the limits of intervention, about what we want pharmacology to be and do, about what kind of relationship we want with our own biology. And perhaps that is enough to have traced this long arc, to have followed the thread from root to molecule, from observation to understanding, from craft to science, to have seen both the triumphs and the tragedies, the lives saved and the harms caused, the knowledge gained and the mysteries that remain. The story of pharmacology is not finished. It continues, evolving, branching, revealing new complexities even as it solves old problems. But for now, in this moment, the telling can rest. The night deepens into that hour when thought becomes diffuse, when the boundaries of attention soften, when the mind begins to drift toward other states. The story has been told, the arc completed, and what remains is simply the quiet, the stillness, the gentle fade of consciousness toward whatever comes next. Outside the window, the world continues its slow turning, and somewhere in laboratories and hospitals, in pharmacies and research institutes, the work goes on, molecules being synthesized, trials being conducted, patients being treated, the great ongoing experiment of pharmacology, of trying to understand and harness chemistry in service of health, of easing suffering, of extending life, of intervening in the molecular processes that constitute being alive. But here, in this room, in this moment, there is only the lamplight and the page and the gathering silence, the story settling into memory, joining all the other stories that make up understanding, that constitute knowledge, that connect past to present, that illuminate the long human effort to comprehend and shape the world. The words slow, the sentences stretch, the thoughts disperse like smoke, and what began with questions, with curiosity, with the desire to trace a path through history, ends with quiet, with stillness, with the simple presence of this moment, this breath, this fading awareness of the lamp, the desk, the night beyond the window, and then nothing more needs saying. The story is complete, the telling done, and all that remains is the gentle dissolution into silence, into rest, into the wordless space where stories end and something else begins, something that doesn't need narration, that simply is quiet, still, complete.